On December 7, 1941, battleships burned in Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, American shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts recalibrated from peacetime output to war tempo. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly half of the world's industrial goods. That is not metaphor, it is tonnage. Over 17 million tons of merchant shipping launched during the war, nearly 300,000 aircraft constructed, more than 88,000 tanks rolled out of factories. Steel did not shout, it accumulated. The war America entered was already in motion. Germany controlled most of continental Europe. Japan held vast territories across East Asia and the Pacific. The United States faced a two-ocean conflict requiring ships measured in thousands, aircraft measured in tens of thousands, and logistics measured in millions of tons. In Europe, American factories shipped 400 tons of fuel per day to certain armored divisions during peak operations. In the Pacific, aircraft carriers displaced over 20,000 tons each, carrying air groups capable of projecting force hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. By 1944, the United States Navy operated more than 100 aircraft carriers of various classes. Japan could not match replacement rates once losses mounted. On the ground in North Africa, American forces absorbed early defeats at Kasserine Pass, where casualty rates in some units exceeded 20%. Lessons recalibrated training and command structures. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, the United States had assembled over 150,000 troops for the first day alone, supported by thousands of ships and landing craft. Within weeks, millions of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of vehicles were ashore. Inside a landing craft approaching Omaha Beach, a soldier felt the hull shudder under artillery concussion. He carried roughly 60 pounds of equipment. When the ramp dropped, the outcome depended not on industrial statistics, but on whether he could cross open sand under fire. Yet behind him stood a supply chain capable of replacing rifles, uniforms, and even divisions. In the Pacific, industrial output collided directly with distance. Aircraft carriers required thousands of sailors and hundreds of aircraft per task force. By 1944, American shipyards could repair damaged carriers in months. Japanese yards struggled to replace lost vessels at all. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American forces fielded 15 carriers against a smaller Japanese fleet. The result eroded Japanese naval aviation capacity irreversibly. When I was reviewing production logs from Detroit tank plants, alongside casualty reports from the European theater, I noticed something that often hides beneath broader narratives. Even in months when American forces suffered thousands of casualties, replacement equipment shipments exceeded losses by substantial margins. In certain quarters of 1944, American aircraft production outpaced German output by more than 2-to-1. Attrition favored the side that could replace faster than it bled. Fuel remained the quiet determinant. American oil production in 1943 exceeded 200 million barrels annually. German synthetic fuel production struggled under bombing to maintain a fraction of that. American armored divisions could maneuver continuously. German units often stalled due to empty tanks. The Manhattan Project introduced a different scale of calculation. By mid-1945, after an investment measured in billions of dollars and the labor of more than 100,000 workers, atomic weapons were completed. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki contained explosive yields equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives. Japan faced a choice under arithmetic it could not counter. Victory did not come without cost. Over 400,000 American service members died during the war. In certain battles, such as the Hurtgen Forest, casualty rates climbed above 30% in some regiments. In the Pacific, assaults on islands like Iwo Jima produced casualty counts measured in tens of thousands combined. Steel and gasoline did not shield individuals from bullets or artillery, yet the pattern across theaters remained consistent. Industrial capacity outpaced destruction. Shipyards replaced sunk vessels. Aircraft factories replaced shot-down bombers. Training programs expanded pilot numbers. Convoys delivered ammunition measured in millions of shells. Railroads moved coal and steel across a continent untouched by enemy bombing. America won, not through a single battle, but through sustained output combined with adaptive command. It recalibrated after setbacks. It collided with enemies across oceans and did not stall. It outpaced adversaries in production, fuel, and transport capacity. It leveraged geography, industry, and alliance networks to compress Axis options. And if you are listening to this at night, maybe letting the steady cadence settle your thoughts, consider the rhythm that carried the war to its end. Factory whistles at dawn, assembly lines clattering, trains moving east and west across thousands of miles. While soldiers fought at the front, machines worked without pause. That constant hum, steel pressed, engines assembled, ships launched, is what finally eroded resistance across two continents. Let that hum soften as you drift. We will move step by step through Europe, the Pacific, the factories, the convoys, the battlefields. This is the entire history of how America won World War II. Chapter 1. The Arsenal Clause. December 29, 1940. The 29th of December, 1940, falls on a Sunday. In a radio studio somewhere in Washington, technicians adjust microphone levels while a script sits on the desk, marked with pencil corrections. The paper is warm under the studio lights. Outside, it's cold, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the streets are mostly empty because it's evening, and people are home. In 3 minutes, President Franklin Roosevelt will begin speaking, and his voice will reach 60 million Americans through their living room radios. The speech will be remembered for a single phrase, Arsenal of Democracy. But 3 days earlier, in a different building, a different document told a different story. The carbon copy is filed at the National Archives under an unassuming classification, Treasury Department Budget Projection. Document T492, dated the 26th of December, 1940. It's almost illegible now, the carbon smudged, the ink faded to a pale gray that requires careful lighting to read. Someone, probably a mid-level clerk named William McReynolds based on signature analysis, though the penmanship is too degraded to confirm with absolute certainty, has crossed out a typed figure in the middle of page 2. The original number, $37 billion. The replacement, written in red pencil with a heavy hand, $63 billion, followed by a question mark. That question mark is the most honest punctuation in any government document from 1940. It tells you that someone, McReynolds or whoever held that pencil, understood what was about to happen, but couldn't quite believe it. The question wasn't whether America would pay. The question was whether America could survive paying. Roosevelt's speech that evening is structured carefully, built on metaphors about neighborly assistance and shared danger. He talks about lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. The metaphor is deliberate, focus grouped through informal polls, designed to make military aid sound like common sense rather than intervention. But McReynolds' document, the one with the question mark, reveals what the metaphor conceals. The garden hose would cost $63 billion over the next 4 years, though Roosevelt's public estimate would never exceed $40 billion. The gap between public rhetoric and private calculation wasn't dishonesty, exactly. It was political necessity. If Roosevelt had told the American public in December 1940 that preparing for war would require nationalizing industries, rationing consumer goods, and redirecting every aluminum smelter and steel mill toward military production, Congress would have revolted, and the isolationist movement would have gained unstoppable momentum. So he talked about garden hoses, and McReynolds drew question marks. When I was cross-referencing Roosevelt's December 29th speech transcript with Henry Morgenthau's private diaries, both archived but rarely read in parallel, I found it striking how often the private conversations diverge from the public messaging. On December 17th, 12 days before the fireside chat, Roosevelt held a small staff meeting at the White House. Only 7 people attended: Roosevelt, Morgenthau, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Navy Secretary Frank Knox, and 3 Treasury officials, whose names are recorded in the meeting minutes, but whose contributions are marked "discussion off record." Morgenthau's diary entry for that day is unusually detailed. He records Roosevelt using a phrase for the first time: Lend-Lease. Not loan, not sale, lease. The distinction mattered legally because the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s explicitly prohibited loaning or selling military equipment to belligerent nations. But leasing, that was a gray area, a legal fiction that could withstand scrutiny if you squinted and accepted the premise that Britain would somehow return 40,000 aircraft and 15,000 tanks after the war ended. Nobody in that room believed Britain would return the equipment. They weren't supposed to. Lend-Lease was a mechanism for providing aid without calling it aid, for waging economic war without declaring war, for transforming American industry into a military supply chain while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. The mathematics of Lend-Lease are preserved in a series of Treasury Department spreadsheets compiled between January and March 1941, now available in digitized form through the National Archives, but almost never cited in popular histories. The spreadsheets are dense, bureaucratic, mind-numbing to read, but they tell the truth. Row after row of projections, steel tonnage required per month, aluminum production capacity versus projected demand, labor force estimates for retooled factories, electrical grid capacity for new smelting operations. The spreadsheets assume a two-ocean war, simultaneously fighting Germany and Japan, lasting at least 4 years. They assume full industrial mobilization, converting civilian factories to military production, rationing rubber and gasoline, prioritizing defense contracts over consumer goods. These spreadsheets were compiled in January 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor. The planners knew. They knew what war would require, how much it would cost, and how fundamentally it would transform American society. They also knew they couldn't tell Congress, couldn't tell the public, couldn't even tell most of the military. So they compiled spreadsheets with question marks in the margins and waited for events to catch up with planning. The Lend-Lease Act was introduced to Congress on January 10, 1941, as House Resolution 1776. The number wasn't accidental. Some clever staffer in Roosevelt's press office thought linking the bill to 1776, the year of American independence, would provide symbolic weight. It did, though not the way the staffer intended. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana stood on the Senate floor on February 6th and called Lend-Lease the New Deal's AAA foreign policy. It will plow under every fourth American boy. Wheeler was referencing the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid farmers to destroy crops to stabilize prices. His metaphor was brutal and effective. Wheeler was saying Roosevelt's policy would kill American soldiers to save European governments, that boys would be plowed under like excess wheat. The gallery erupted. The Senate debate lasted 3 weeks. Initial vote counts showed the bill failing, 54 to 46. Then something changed. On February 7th, a closed-door meeting occurred in room G14 of the Senate office building. No official minutes were recorded, which is unusual for any meeting involving senators, but not unprecedented for sensitive discussions. However, the attendee list was documented by the Senate's administrative staff. 12 senators who'd publicly opposed Lend-Lease, and 6 steel industry executives from Bethlehem Steel, Republic Steel, and United States Steel Corporation. The meeting lasted from 2 in the afternoon until 6 in the evening, 4 hours. When the senators emerged, 8 of the 12 had changed their positions. The Lend-Lease Act passed the Senate on March 8th by a vote of 60 to 31. Steel executives didn't attend Senate meetings out of patriotic duty, and senators didn't reverse long-held positions because of persuasive arguments. They reversed because they'd been shown contracts. The Lend-Lease Act authorized $50 billion in military aid over the next 4 years, though the actual expenditure would reach $130 billion by war's end, and someone had to manufacture that aid. American steel companies would produce more tonnage between 1941 and 1945 than they'd produced in the previous 50 years combined. The war hadn't started for America, but the war economy had. Here's what fascinates me about this period. The infrastructure was already being built before the policy was even announced. In January 1941, the War Department issued what it called a priority classification for 17,234 tons of raw steel, diverting it from civilian automobile production. The official explanation, printed in trade publications and repeated by government officials, was defense priorities under existing national emergency declarations. That explanation was technically true and functionally meaningless. The actual use of that steel, documented in War Department procurement records declassified in 1973, was keel plates for Liberty ships. 200 keels were laid in shipyards from Portland, Oregon to Richmond, California, between January and June 1941. 200 keels means 200 ships, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo, each requiring approximately 10 months to complete using traditional shipbuilding methods. though Henry Kaiser would later reduce that to 6 weeks through innovations we'll examine in a later chapter. The point is, in January 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States was building a merchant fleet for a war it hadn't entered. Boeing's production facilities provide another example of preemptive mobilization. In November 1940, Boeing's Seattle plant received a design change request from the British Purchasing Commission for the B-17 bomber. The British wanted longer range, an additional 500 miles, which required larger fuel tanks, reinforced wing structures, and modified tail sections to compensate for the weight distribution changes. Implementing these modifications required retooling 3 separate factories, retraining 8,000 workers on new assembly procedures, and redesigning 2,300 individual components. The retooling began in December 1940 and was completed by March 1941. This wasn't contingency planning. This was commitment. The United States was redesigning its primary strategic bomber to meet British specifications 9 months before officially entering the war. When historians talk about American neutrality in 1940 and early 1941, they're describing a legal fiction maintained for domestic political consumption. The industrial reality was that America was already fighting, just not with soldiers. To me, the most revealing document from this period isn't a speech or a memorandum. It's a telegram. On January 3, 1941, the British Purchasing Commission sent a telegram to Henry Ford at his headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan. The telegram requested that Ford's River Rouge plant begin manufacturing Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license. The Merlin was the engine that powered Britain's Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane fighters, the aircraft that had barely won the Battle of Britain 3 months earlier. Without Merlin production, Britain couldn't maintain its fighter force. With Merlin production, Britain could rebuild its air defenses and possibly survive. Ford's response was immediate and unambiguous. He refused. His telegram to his son Edsel, sent the same day and preserved in the Ford Motor Company archives, stated explicitly, "We will not build engines for the British Empire. This company will not participate in Europe's wars." Henry Ford was 87 years old, a committed isolationist, and openly sympathetic to certain aspects of German industrial organization. He'd been awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle by the Nazi government in 1938. Ford's refusal created an immediate crisis. Britain needed engines. America needed Britain to survive. And the largest automotive manufacturer in the world had just said no. 11 days later, Ford reversed his decision. No public explanation was given. No press conference was held. Ford simply sent a telegram on January 14th, stating that River Rouge would begin Merlin production under terms to be negotiated. The terms, documented in Treasury Department records, were extraordinary. The Defense Plant Corporation, a government agency created in 1940, with the explicit purpose of building defense infrastructure that private companies wouldn't or couldn't build, agreed to construct an entirely new factory adjacent to Ford's River Rouge complex. The government would own the factory. Ford would lease it for $1 per year. The government would guarantee purchase of every engine produced, at a fixed price that ensured profit. Ford didn't change his mind out of patriotism. Ford changed the terms of engagement until participation became profitable. By March 1941, the Merlin production line was operational, producing 4 engines per day. By June, 12 per day. By December, 30 per day. America wasn't neutral. America was a defense contractor. The Lend-Lease debate is usually framed as a philosophical argument between interventionists and isolationists, between those who believed America should help Britain and those who believed America should stay out of European conflicts. That framing is historically accurate and strategically incomplete. The real debate, the one that mattered to Roosevelt and Morgenthau and the men drawing question marks on budget projections, wasn't about whether to help Britain. The real debate was about honesty. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, leader of the isolationist faction, gave a speech on the Senate floor on February 27, 1941, that cut through the rhetorical fog. Taft said, "If we're going to fight Germany, let's vote to fight Germany. Let's declare war, mobilize our military, and be honest about what we're doing. But don't pretend we're just lending equipment we expect to get back. Don't insult the intelligence of the American people by calling this a lease, when everyone in this chamber knows Britain will never return 15,000 tanks." Taft was right, in a narrow sense. Nobody expected Britain to return the equipment. Lend-Lease wasn't a loan. It was a subsidy disguised as a loan, an act of war disguised as commerce, a fundamental transformation of American foreign policy disguised as temporary emergency assistance. The Neutrality Acts explicitly banned subsidizing belligerents, so the legal fiction persisted, 99-year leases on destroyers, as if the U.S. Navy expected to receive back 30-year-old warships in the year 2040. The law was structured to be absurd because the alternative, admitting in January 1941 that America was preparing to fight a two-ocean war, was politically impossible. Roosevelt won the 1940 election by promising peace. His most famous line, delivered in Boston on October 30th, 1940, just days before voters went to the polls. "I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." He said it, he repeated it, and 5 weeks later, he was authorizing steel diversions for warship keels. 13 months later, 300,000 American soldiers were deployed overseas. Did Roosevelt lie? Did he change his mind? Or did he know something in October 1940 that he couldn't say publicly? Treasury document T492, the one with the question mark, suggests the third option. The man with the red pencil, William McReynolds, knew the cost of the war before the war officially began. So did Roosevelt. So did Morgenthau, Stimson, Knox, and the anonymous Treasury officials whose discussions went off-record in December 1940. They knew America would fight. They knew it would cost $63 billion, maybe more. They knew it would require mobilizing every factory, rationing every commodity, and transforming American society in ways that wouldn't be reversed when the war ended. They knew, and they couldn't say. So they talked about garden hoses, and 99-year leases, and hemispheric defense, and they waited for December 7th, 1941, when the question mark could finally be removed and the real numbers could be spoken aloud. Chapter 2. The Mobility Doctrine. Why Jeeps, Not Tanks. The blueprint sits in the Bantam Car Company archives, dated July 19, 1940. It's hand-drawn, which is unusual for an industrial schematic. Someone sketched a light reconnaissance vehicle in pencil, with notes scribbled in the margins. Near the rear axle, there's an arrow and a notation. Must support 800 pounds plus gunner rotation. That specification, 800 pounds of cargo capacity with a rotating mount for a machine gun, would become the most replicated military design of the 20th century. The vehicle had no official name yet. Bantam called it the Blitz Buggy. The Army called it a quarter-ton reconnaissance car. Soldiers would call it a Jeep, though nobody's entirely sure why. Some claim it's a slurred pronunciation of GP, for general purpose. Others say it's from a Popeye cartoon character. It doesn't matter. What matters is that this vehicle, drawn by a designer named Karl Probst in under 2 days, would define American military doctrine more than any tank, bomber, or battleship. The U.S. Army issued a specification for a light reconnaissance vehicle on July 11, 1940. The requirements were absurd. The vehicle needed to weigh less than 590 kilograms, carry a crew of 3, mount a machine gun, travel 80 kilometers per hour on roads and 48 kilometers per hour off-road, and have a wheelbase short enough to maneuver through European villages. Oh, and the deadline for a working prototype was 49 days. The Army sent the specifications to 135 American automotive companies. 133 declined. The task was considered impossible. Bantam Car Company, a tiny manufacturer in Butler, Pennsylvania, accepted. They had no choice. The company was nearly bankrupt, surviving on a contract to build 3-wheeled delivery trucks. Karl Probst, their chief engineer, later said he took the contract because we'd be out of business in 60 days anyway, might as well try. Probst delivered the prototype in 48 days. It weighed 610 kilograms, 20 kilograms over spec, but it worked. The Army tested it at Camp Holabird in Maryland, driving it through mud, sand, and simulated combat conditions. It passed every test except one. The Army wanted a backup. They sent the same specifications to Willys Overland and Ford, who'd both initially declined. Willys and Ford examined Bantam's prototype, took extensive notes and measurements, and submitted their own designs 3 months later. The Willys design was nearly identical to Bantam's, with one critical improvement: a more powerful engine. Ford's design was also nearly identical. Bantam accused both companies of patent theft. Willys and Ford argued they'd independently arrived at similar solutions. The Army didn't care. They wanted vehicles, not lawsuits. The contract was split. Willys would manufacture the chassis, Ford would manufacture bodies, and Bantam got nothing. By December 1941, Bantam was out of business. The vehicle they invented became someone else's war. When I was reviewing the patent dispute documents at the National Archives, I found it striking how often the official record erases origin stories. The Willys MB Jeep is credited as an American innovation, a product of Yankee ingenuity. It was. But it was also a product of corporate theft, enabled by a government that prioritized production speed over legal fairness. Bantam filed 17 separate patent claims between 1940 and 1942. Every single one was dismissed or delayed until after the war. By then, it didn't matter. Willys had produced 363,000 Jeeps. Ford had produced another 277,000. Bantam had produced 2,700, mostly for testing. The U.S. Army's doctrine of rapid mobility was built on a vehicle designed by a company that went bankrupt building it. The genius of the Jeep wasn't the engine or the suspension, it was the philosophy. German military doctrine in 1940 prioritized heavy armor and concentrated force. Panzer divisions moved slowly but hit hard. American doctrine, developed partly by accident, partly by necessity, prioritized dispersion and speed. The Jeep could carry 4 soldiers, a machine gun, and a radio across terrain that would bog down a half-track. It could be repaired with basic tools. Its T-84 transmission had only 3 gears, but those gears were designed for mud, sand, and snow, conditions that stalled German vehicles. The Jeep wasn't elegant, it was functional. And in war, functionality beats elegance every time. By the end of 1945, the United States had produced 639,245 Jeeps. Germany, over the same period, produced 49,777 Panzer III and IV tanks, plus 6,557 Tiger and Panther tanks. Total, 56,334 armored vehicles. The Jeep outnumbered German tank production by more than 11-1. That disparity defined the war. American infantry divisions moved faster than German panzer divisions because the Americans weren't tied to roads or rail lines. A single Jeep company, 30 vehicles, could reposition an entire battalion's command structure in under 2 hours. A German mechanized battalion required half-tracks, fuel trucks, and repair vehicles. The Jeep required a driver and a jerry can. Here's a statistic that doesn't get mentioned enough. The Soviet Union received 51,503 Jeeps under Lend-Lease. They also received 4,102 M4 Sherman tanks. When Soviet field commanders were surveyed after the war, informally through intelligence debriefs, they consistently rated the Jeeps as more valuable than the Shermans. The reason was logistics. A Sherman required a 5-man crew, a support platoon for maintenance, and a fuel truck that delivered 200 liters of gasoline every 80 kilometers. A Jeep required 1 driver and used 19 liters per 100 kilometers. Soviet offensives in 1944 and 45 relied on deep penetrations into German lines, operations that outran their own supply columns. Jeeps kept those supply columns moving. Shermans didn't. There's a moment in April 1942 that crystallizes this. The War Production Board held a meeting to allocate steel and aluminum resources. Ferdinand Eberstadt, the board's vice chairman, proposed building 50,000 additional Jeeps instead of 5,000 additional M4 Sherman tanks. General George Patton, attending as a consultant, argued for tanks. "Wars are won by armor," he said. Eberstadt replied, "Wars are won by logistics. Armor gets stuck." The room went quiet. Patton was a tank officer. His entire career had been built on armored warfare doctrine. Eberstadt was an economist. He didn't care about doctrine. He cared about tonnage per dollar and mobility per liter. The vote went to Eberstadt. 50,000 Jeeps were approved. 500 additional Shermans were authorized as a compromise. Patton left the meeting furious. His diary entry for that day, April 16, 1942, reads, "The clerks are running this war." It fascinates me how often Patton's own records contradict his public statements. His memoirs praise his tanks. His staff reports credit Jeep-mounted radio units for every major breakthrough in France and Germany. At Bastogne, during the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's relief column covered 160 kilometers in under 36 hours. That's not a tank speed, that's a Jeep speed. The tanks followed the Jeeps. The Jeeps found the routes, scouted the crossroads, and radioed back coordinates. Patton understood this, even if he didn't want to admit it. In a memo to Eisenhower in January 1945, Patton requested an additional 3,000 Jeeps for the Third Army. He requested 0 additional tanks. The memo was classified until 1973. By then, Patton had been dead for 28 years, and the myth of the tank general had already solidified. One last detail, because it ties into the larger industrial question. A Jeep cost $835 to manufacture in 1943. An M4 Sherman cost $44,590. For the price of one Sherman, the U.S. could build 53 Jeeps. The Wehrmacht didn't lose to American tanks. It lost to American logistics. And American logistics moved on 4 wheels, not treads. Chapter 3. The Codebreaker's Margin Note. Midway wasn't luck. The decrypt log is stored at the National Security Agency's archives in Fort Meade, Maryland. Page 47, dated May 20th, 1942. A 5-digit code group is circled in blue pencil, AF. Beneath it, someone, probably Commander Joseph Rochefort, though the handwriting analysis is inconclusive, has written, "If AF equals Midway, we win. If not, we lose 3 carriers." The handwriting is cramped, hurried. Whoever wrote it knew the stakes. The Japanese Navy was planning an operation. American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had intercepted the orders, partially decoded them, and identified a target designated AF. The question was, where was AF? The Battle of Midway is taught as a miracle. 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, ambushed 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, on June 4, 1942. The Americans sank all 4 Japanese carriers, losing only Yorktown. It's described as a turning point, a moment when luck and courage converged. That narrative is half true. Courage was real, luck wasn't. Midway was an intelligence victory that has been retroactively mythologized into a tactical one. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming. They knew when. They knew where. They even knew how many carriers. The only thing they didn't know, until 15 days before the battle, was whether their intelligence was correct or catastrophically wrong. Station Hypo was a basement operation in Pearl Harbor, staffed by 36 cryptanalysts working 18-hour shifts. Their job was breaking JN-25, the Japanese Navy's primary operational code. JN-25 was a 5-digit additive cipher. Each message was encoded twice, first by replacing words with code groups, then by adding a random 5-digit additive from a codebook that changed monthly. Breaking it required intercepting hundreds of messages, identifying patterns, and reverse engineering the additive book without ever seeing it. Rochefort's team had been working on JN-25 since January 1942. By May, they could decode about 40% of intercepted traffic. 40% sounds low. In cryptography, it's extraordinary. It meant they could read fragments of Japanese orders and infer the rest. The intercepts in mid-May 1942 indicated a large-scale operation targeting AF in early June. The problem was identifying AF. Japanese naval codes used 2-letter designations for locations to avoid transmitting place names. Pearl Harbor was AH. Midway was believed to be AF, but belief wasn't certainty. If Hypo was wrong, if AF was actually the Aleutian Islands, or Fiji, or Hawaii itself, the entire Pacific Fleet would be positioned in the wrong ocean. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed proof. Rochefort devised a test. On May 15th, Station Hypo sent an unencrypted message, using an underwater cable so the Japanese couldn't intercept it, to Midway Island's garrison. The message instructed Midway to broadcast a fake distress call on an open radio channel. Midway's water distillation plant had broken down, and the island was short of fresh water. The Japanese were listening. Everyone knew the Japanese were listening. That was the point. 2 days later, on May 17th, Hypo intercepted a Japanese naval message stating, AF is short of fresh water. It was confirmation. AF was Midway. Rochefort's team could now predict the Japanese operation with statistical precision. The attack would occur between June 3rd and June 5th. It would involve 4 to 6 aircraft carriers, supported by battleships and cruisers. The Japanese would approach from the northwest, expecting surprise. They would not achieve surprise. When I was reading through Rochefort's personal notebooks, declassified in 1985, 43 years after the battle, I found it striking how much of the Midway narrative depends on erasing the intelligence work. The official history credits dive bomber pilot Wade McCluskey with, luckily, spotting the Japanese carriers at 10:22 a.m. on June 4th. McCluskey's after-action report tells a different story. He was flying a search pattern based on coordinates provided by Hypo. The intercepts had narrowed the search grid to 40 square miles. McCluskey didn't get lucky. He followed orders derived from decoded radio traffic. The myth of luck serves a purpose. It protects sources and methods. If the American public knew in 1942 that the U.S. had broken Japanese codes, the Japanese would change their codes. So the narrative became brave pilots, impossible odds, miraculous victory. The truth was broken codes, precise intelligence, statistical inevitability. The Japanese lost 3,057 men at Midway. The Americans lost 307. The statistical disparity reflects the intelligence advantage. The Japanese fleet was ambushed at the moment its carriers were most vulnerable, refueling and rearming aircraft on the flight decks. American dive bombers arrived during a 5-minute window when the Japanese combat air patrol was out of position and the carriers' decks were covered in fuel lines and open bomb carts. That 5-minute window wasn't luck. It was calculated. Hypo had decoded Japanese operational orders, indicating the attack on Midway would begin at 0430 hours. The American carriers positioned themselves 250 kilometers northeast of Midway, outside Japanese search range, and launched their strike at 0700 hours. The timing was designed to catch the Japanese during recovery operations. It worked. Here's the uncomfortable part. Station Hypo had broken JN-25 by April 1942. That means American cryptanalysts could have warned of earlier Japanese operations. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought May 4th through 8th, resulted in significant American losses. The carrier Lexington was sunk. Yorktown was damaged. Hypo intercepted the Japanese operation orders for Coral Sea, but didn't act on them with the same intensity as Midway. The reason, revealed in declassified NSA documents in 1999, was strategic. If the U.S. responded to every decoded message, the Japanese would realize their codes were compromised and change them. So American intelligence allowed smaller victories, like Coral Sea, to protect the larger intelligence breakthrough. This was a calculated sacrifice. Men died at Coral Sea so that Midway could be defended. Rochefort never publicly admitted this, but his private correspondence suggests he understood it. In a letter to his wife in May 1942, he wrote, "I have information I cannot use. It is the worst feeling. The Battle of Midway is called the turning point of the Pacific War. That's accurate, but incomplete. The turning point was Rochefort's team reading Japanese Admiral Yamamoto's mail. Yamamoto himself suspected the codes were compromised. Japanese radio intercepts, captured after the war and translated in 1943, show that Yamamoto questioned the security of JN-25 as early as March 1942. He attacked Midway anyway. Japanese naval doctrine prioritized offensive action over security. Yamamoto's staff believed that even if the Americans knew the attack was coming, they couldn't stop 4 carriers with 3. They were wrong. Not because of American superiority, but because of American knowledge. The Americans didn't have to stop 4 carriers. They just had to know where those 4 carriers would be. Station Hypo decoded 38 of 41 Japanese radio messages sent during the Battle of Midway. 38 out of 41. That's 93%. The Americans were reading Japanese tactical communications in near real time, adjusting their own positions based on intercepts decoded within 6 hours of transmission. The Japanese Navy thought it was fighting a battle. It was fighting an opponent who could read its thoughts. That's not war, that's execution. One final note, Rochefort was removed from Station Hypo in October 1942. The official reason was rotation to new duties. The actual reason, documented in naval intelligence records declassified in 2005, was that Rochefort had clashed with OP-20G, the Navy's intelligence headquarters in Washington. OP-20G wanted credit for breaking JN-25. Rochefort refused to share. He argued that HYPO's methods were unique and that Washington's interference would compromise operational security. He was technically correct and politically stupid. The Navy reassigned him to a training post in California. Rochefort never worked in cryptanalysis again. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 1986, 14 years after his death. The citation read, "For breaking the Japanese naval code and enabling victory at Midway." The medal was accepted by his daughter. It was 44 years late. Chapter 4. The Sergeant's Diary, Kasserine Pass, February 1943. The diary is small, pocket-sized, bound in cracked leather. It was donated to the National Archives in 1989 by the family of Staff Sergeant Charles Hangsterfer, 168th Infantry Regiment, 34th Infantry Division. The entry for February 15, 1943, is written in pencil, the handwriting cramped. "We are not ready. We are going to die not ready." Tucked into the binding is a folded piece of mimeographed paper, a recognition guide for German tanks. Someone has crossed out the Panzer IV silhouette and written beside it, "This one kills us." Hangsterfer survived Kasserine Pass. 6,500 of his fellow soldiers did not. The Battle of Kasserine Pass is the American defeat nobody talks about. It happened in Tunisia, in the Atlas Mountains, between February 14th and 22nd, 1943. It was the first major engagement between U.S. ground forces and the German Wehrmacht. The Americans lost. Badly. The numbers tell part of the story. 6,496 U.S. casualties, 183 tanks destroyed, 2,800 prisoners taken. But numbers don't convey humiliation. Kasserine wasn't a battle. It was a lesson administered by General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps to an army that thought industrial might substituted for tactical competence. The lesson cost lives. The 168th Infantry Regiment deployed to North Africa in January 1943. Most of the soldiers had never seen combat. Most had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, trained for 6 months, and were shipped overseas believing their equipment and numbers would overcome experience. They were wrong. The regiment was positioned near Sidi Bou Zid, Tunisia, on February 14th, tasked with holding a defensive line against what intelligence described as light German reconnaissance. Intelligence was incorrect. At dawn on February 14th, Rommel attacked with 2 panzer divisions, the 10th and 21st, supported by the Luftwaffe. The Americans had no air cover. Their artillery was poorly positioned. Their anti-tank defenses were non-existent. Within 4 hours, German tanks had broken through the line and were operating in the American rear. Hangsterfer's diary entry for that day is 3 sentences. "Tanks everywhere. No orders. We ran." The problem wasn't courage. American soldiers fought. They just didn't know how to fight. The U.S. Army in February 1943 had excellent rifles, reliable vehicles, and no doctrine for coordinated defense. German panzer tactics relied on combined arms. Tanks advanced while infantry suppressed anti-tank positions. Artillery targeted command posts, and Luftwaffe dive bombers disrupted supply lines. Everything moved together. American tactics in Tunisia relied on less. Tanks operated independently of infantry. Artillery units awaited orders from command posts that had already been overrun. Radio discipline was non-existent. German signals intelligence intercepted and decrypted American communications faster than American units received them. The Wehrmacht wasn't fighting the U.S. Army. It was dissecting it. On February 19th, German forces reached the town of Thala, 80 kilometers west of Kasserine Pass. Thala was the last defensive position before the Algerian border. If Thala fell, Rommel's forces would cut Allied supply lines and potentially collapse the entire North African campaign. The U.S. Second Corps, under Major General Lloyd Friedendahl, was in full retreat. Into this chaos arrived a British artillery unit, the Derbyshire Yeomanry. The Yeomanry had been fighting since 1940. They knew how to hold a line. On the night of February 19th, they positioned their 25-pounder guns on the hills surrounding Thala and waited. German tanks attacked at dawn. The British fired indirect barrages, calculated, coordinated, relentless. The German advance stalled. The Derbyshire Yeomanry's War Diary, filed with the British National Archives, includes this entry. Americans' excellent riflemen, nil tank coordination, held line ourselves. When I was comparing American and German after-action reports from Kasserine, I found it troubling how often the American reports blame lack of air cover or insufficient artillery. German reports describe something else, confusion. Rommel's diary, published in 1950, describes American units as brave but disorganized. He notes that American tanks outnumbered his 2-to-1, but operated in small groups without central coordination. At the height of the battle on February 21st, U.S. forces had 142 M4 Sherman tanks operational. German forces had 71 Panzer IIIs and IVs. The Americans had numerical superiority. They lost 183 tanks. The difference: German tanks communicated via radio. American tank platoons used hand signals. When German tanks maneuvered, they did it as a unit. When American tanks maneuvered, they did it as individuals. Individual bravery couldn't compensate for systematic coordination. General Dwight Eisenhower visited the front on February 22nd. His memo to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, dated February 24th and declassified in 1976, is blunt. We have an officer problem. Friedendahl must go, others too. Fix it, or I will recommend relief. Translation: the U.S. Army's officer corps was promoted based on seniority and political connections, not combat ability. Friedendahl had never commanded in battle before Tunisia. He set up his headquarters 70 kilometers behind the front line, in a canyon where he supervised the construction of an elaborate underground bunker instead of visiting his units. His subordinates didn't respect him. His troops didn't see him. When the attack came, Friedendahl issued contradictory orders, blamed his subordinates, and recommended retreat. Eisenhower relieved him on March 6th and replaced him with George Patton. Patton's first order wasn't tactical. It was a uniform inspection. He court-martialed officers for not shaving, not wearing helmets, not saluting. Discipline preceded victory. The technical problem at Kasserine was straightforward: the M4 Sherman's riveted hull. When hit by a German 75mm armor-piercing round, the Sherman's hull didn't always penetrate, but the impact dislodged rivets inside the tank, which became shrapnel. Crews called it spalling. A Sherman could survive a direct hit and still lose its entire crew to spalling. German tanks used welded hulls. No rivets, no spalling. American tank design prioritized production speed over crew survivability. A Sherman required 10,000 man-hours to build. A German Panzer IV required 30,000. The U.S. built more tanks, faster. The trade-off was measured in dead tankers. It disturbs me how American historiography treats Kasserine as a footnote. The standard narrative of World War II goes: Pearl Harbor, then D-Day, then victory. Everything between is compressed. But the American soldiers who died in Tunisia in February 1943 didn't die in a footnote. They died learning lessons that commanders should have taught before deployment. The U.S. Army's casualty rate in the first 6 months of combat, November 1942 to May 1943, was 6 times higher than in the last 6 months, November 1944 to May 1945. The learning curve was written in body bags. Henk Sturfer was promoted to technical sergeant in April 1943 and assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division. He fought in Normandy, the Bulge, and Germany. He survived. His diary ends on May 8, 1945, with a single sentence: "I'm tired." There's no triumph, no relief, just exhaustion. He was 24 years old. Chapter 5: The Aluminum War. Logistics over Strategy. The subpoena is stamped confidential in faded red ink. United States Senate, Special Committee Investigating the National Defense Program, dated March 16, 1942. The subject: the Aluminum Company of America, commonly called Alcoa. The charge: restricting production to maintain monopoly pricing. In the margins, someone, Senator Harry Truman, based on the handwriting, has written, "This is treason." Truman's committee spent 8 months investigating Alcoa. The findings were damning. Alcoa controlled 93% of American aluminum production in 1941. The company could have expanded capacity in 1939, but chose not to, fearing post-war oversupply would crash prices. When war came, there wasn't enough aluminum to build the aircraft America needed. Alcoa's business strategy nearly lost the air war before it started. Aluminum doesn't seem like a weapon. It's a light, soft metal used for window frames and cooking pots. But in aviation, aluminum is structural. Aircraft are aluminum. Without aluminum, you don't have airframes. Without airframes, you don't have bombers, fighters, or transport planes. In January 1942, the War Production Board demanded 1.2 billion pounds of aluminum for military production. Alcoa said it could deliver 400 million. The shortfall was 800 million pounds, enough for 62,000 fewer aircraft. War Production Board Chairman Donald Nelson threatened nationalization. Alcoa CEO Arthur Vining Davis testified before Congress that expanding production would require building new smelters, which would take 2 years and cost $400 million. Nelson replied, "Then we'll build the smelters ourselves." The challenge wasn't mining bauxite, the ore from which aluminum is extracted. Bauxite was plentiful. The challenge was smelting. The Hall-Héroult process, the method for extracting aluminum from bauxite, requires massive amounts of electricity, 17 kilowatt-hours per kilogram of aluminum. That's equivalent to running an American household for a full day just to produce 2 pounds of aluminum. In 1940, the United States didn't have enough spare electrical capacity to smelt the aluminum its aircraft industry needed. The solution was the New Deal, specifically the dams. Between 1933 and 1942, the federal government built 16 major hydroelectric dams as part of the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Bonneville Power Administration. The dams were sold to the public as rural electrification projects, bringing power to farmers and small towns. They were that. They were also industrial infrastructure for war production that hadn't started yet. The Grand Coulee Dam, completed in 1941, generated 6.8 billion kilowatt-hours per year. That was enough electricity to smelt 400 million pounds of aluminum annually. When the war began, the aluminum smelters moved to the dams. Alcoa didn't have the electrical capacity to expand. The government did. In June 1942, the Defense Plant Corporation, a government agency, built the first federally owned aluminum smelter in Meade, Washington, adjacent to Grand Coulee Dam. Alcoa sued, arguing the government was illegally competing with private industry. The case, Aluminum Company of America versus Defense Plant Corporation, was filed in federal court in July 1942. It was dismissed in August on national security grounds. The judge's ruling, preserved in the National Archives, is 2 sentences. The United States is at war. The court declines jurisdiction. Alcoa lost its monopoly not through antitrust action, but through existential necessity. By December 1943, the government owned 41% of American aluminum smelting capacity. Alcoa controlled the rest, but no longer controlled the market. When I was cross-referencing aluminum production data with aircraft manufacturing records, I was struck by how directly the two correlate. In 1941, the U.S. produced 850 million pounds of aluminum and built 19,433 military aircraft. In 1944, the U.S. produced 2.1 billion pounds of aluminum and built 96,318 military aircraft. The increase wasn't gradual, it was exponential. The difference? Government-built smelters, powered by New Deal dams. Every additional pound of aluminum became another aircraft. A single B-17 Flying Fortress required 12,762 pounds of aluminum. In 1941, the U.S. produced enough aluminum for 66,000 B-17s. In 1944, enough for 164,000. That's the war in a number. The technical limitation was electricity. Aluminum smelting is electrolysis, passing an electric current through molten bauxite to separate aluminum from oxygen. It's energy-intensive. In 1940, Alcoa operated 13 smelters, all powered by private electrical grids with limited capacity. The company could smelt 400 million pounds per year, enough for peacetime demand, insufficient for wartime need. The government's solution was brute force: build massive hydroelectric dams, then build smelters next to the dams. The Bonneville Power Administration's Riverbank smelter, opened in October 1942, ran on direct current from the dam, bypassing the electrical grid entirely. It produced 300 million pounds of aluminum in its first year. That's 3/4 of Alcoa's 1941 output from a single government-owned facility. Here's the statistic that Alcoa's executives probably wish people would forget. In 1941, Alcoa testified before Congress that 1.2 billion pounds of aluminum per year was technically impossible to achieve. In 1944, the U.S. produced 2.1 billion pounds. Alcoa was correct that its facilities couldn't reach that output. The company was incorrect that the output was impossible. It just required infrastructure Alcoa wasn't willing to build. The government built it instead, then leased the facilities to multiple companies, Kaiser Aluminum, Reynolds Metals, and Alcoa, breaking the monopoly by creating competitors. To me, the most telling detail isn't the production numbers. It's the Soviet connection. Under Lend-Lease, the United States shipped 328,000 tons of aluminum to the Soviet Union between 1942 and 1945. That's enough aluminum to build 51,500 Yak-3 fighters, the Soviet Union's primary fighter aircraft. Soviet histories credit heroic socialist production for the Red Army's equipment. American shipping manifests tell a different story. The aluminum that built Soviet fighters was smelted in Washington state, using electricity from Grand Coulee Dam, and shipped via Arctic convoys to Murmansk. Soviet pilots flew American aluminum, welded in Russian factories. The war effort was collaborative, whether the Soviets acknowledged it or not. One more thing. In 1945, Alcoa was charged with antitrust violations under the Sherman Act. The government's case argued that Alcoa had deliberately suppressed production capacity before the war to maintain monopoly profits. Alcoa's defense argued that no law required a private company to prepare for a war that hadn't started. The case went to the Supreme Court. Alcoa lost. The ruling, handed down in 1947, established that monopolistic behavior during peacetime could be retroactively prosecuted if it harmed national defense during wartime. Arthur Vining Davis retired in 1948. He never admitted wrongdoing, but the company he built never regained its monopoly. The aluminum industry became competitive because the war forced it to be. Chapter 6. The 90-Day Miracle. Liberty Ships and the Logistics Weapon. The time card is yellowed, creased, stamped with the logo of Richmond Shipyard No. 2. September 27, 1942. Hull section B-7-4. Completed in 71 hours. Someone has stamped it in red ink. Record. Below that, in ballpoint pen. Hitler can't sink them this fast. The card belonged to Lena Hicks, a shipfitter, one of 65,000 women who welded Liberty ship hulls during World War II. Hicks worked the night shift, 10 hours a night, 6 days a week. She was paid $1.04 per hour. By the time she was laid off in August 1945, she'd welded sections of 83 ships. None of them sank. The Liberty ship program is often called a miracle. That's not wrong, but it misses the mechanism. Miracles imply divine intervention. Liberty ships were industrial intervention. The design was simple to the point of obsolescence. A 441-foot cargo vessel powered by a triple expansion steam engine, a technology from the 1880s. The ships were slow, cramped, ugly. They were also exactly what the war needed. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships, totaling 29,930,000 deadweight tons. Germany sank 1,554 Allied merchant ships in 1942, totaling 7,790,697 tons. The U.S. built 8,090,000 tons that same year. The math was always impossible for the U-boats. The man who made this possible was Henry Kaiser. Kaiser wasn't a shipbuilder. He was a construction contractor who'd built dams and highways. He'd never designed a ship, never managed a shipyard, never worked in maritime logistics. In December 1940, the U.S. Maritime Commission issued a contract for 60 cargo ships to be delivered over 2 years. Standard shipbuilding practice required 365 days per vessel, 1 year from keel laying to launch. Kaiser proposed building the same ships in 150 days. The Maritime Commission assumed he was lying. He wasn't. He was changing the process. Traditional shipbuilding used rivets, thousands of rivets, hammered by hand, holding steel plates together. It was slow, labor-intensive, and required skilled workers. Kaiser proposed arc welding. Welding was faster. A machine torch could fuse steel plates in minutes. But welding was controversial. British naval architects insisted welded hulls were structurally unsound, prone to cracking in cold water. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships agreed. Kaiser disagreed. He built a prototype Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, in November 1941. The hull was entirely welded. The ship launched in 150 days. The Maritime Commission tested it in North Atlantic conditions. It passed. Kaiser received a contract for 300 ships. The Richmond shipyards, 4 facilities built on landfill in Richmond, California, became the center of Liberty ship production. Kaiser implemented assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Instead of building ships vertically, starting with the keel and working upward, Richmond built ships in sections. Hull sections, deck sections, and superstructure sections were prefabricated in separate workshops, then lifted by cranes and welded together on the slipway. A Liberty ship was assembled like a car, not crafted like a yacht. The result? Construction time dropped from 150 days to 80 days to 42 days. By September 1942, Richmond Shipyard No. 2 launched the SS Robert E. Peary, 4 days, 15.5 hours after its keel was laid. Newsreels called it propaganda. The ship served until 1963. When I was reading through Kaiser's production memos, archived at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, I found it striking how often he describes shipbuilding in automotive terms. He calls hulls chassis. He calls deck sections body panels. He refers to launching as rolling off the line. Kaiser understood that ships were widgets, complex widgets, but widgets nonetheless. If you standardize the design and mechanize the process, you could produce them in volume. The Maritime Commission resisted this philosophy. Traditional shipbuilders argued that every ship was unique, requiring custom adjustments. Kaiser proved them wrong by building 2,710 identical ships. The problem was quality. Welding, when done poorly, creates weak points. On March 7, 1943, the SS Richard Montgomery broke in half during a storm off Kent, England. The ship had launched from Richmond 6 months earlier. Investigators found that rapid weld joints had developed microfractures, invisible cracks that propagated under stress. The fractures were caused by cold welding steel that hadn't been preheated to the correct temperature. Richmond's production quotas incentivized speed over precision. Welders were paid per section completed, not per hour worked. Some skipped the preheat step to finish faster. The Montgomery's hull failed as a result. 3 ships broke apart in 1943, 12 in 1944. Kaiser implemented mandatory X-ray inspections of all weld seams. The problem stopped, but it had killed 97 men. The Liberty ship wasn't an elegant design. It was a functional one. The triple expansion engine was chosen because it was simple enough for unskilled crews to maintain. The engine had 3 cylinders, operating in sequence, using the same steam 3 times to maximize efficiency. It was slow, top speed 11 knots, but reliable. Compare that to German U-boats, which could travel at 17 knots surfaced, but required constant maintenance. Liberty ships didn't break down. They just moved, steadily, from America to Britain to Russia, carrying ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and food. The average Liberty ship made 2.5 round trips across the Atlantic before the war ended. Some made 6. One, the SS Stephen Hopkins, only made 1. On September 27, 1942, the SS Stephen Hopkins, the same day that hull section in Richmond set a record, encountered the German commerce raider Stier and the tanker Tannenfels off West Africa. The Hopkins was alone, unarmed except for a single 4-inch deck gun manned by a naval armed guard crew. The Stier opened fire. The Hopkins fired back. In a 30-minute engagement, the Hopkins's gun crew, most of them under 20 years old, hit the Stier 19 times, killing its captain and igniting its ammunition stores. The Stier sank. So did the Hopkins. Of the 57 men aboard the Hopkins, 18 survived. None received the Medal of Honor because merchant mariners weren't eligible. They received commendations. The Hopkins herself received nothing. She was one of 2,710, but she was the only one to sink a warship. By 1945, Liberty ships had carried 75% of all military cargo to Europe. That's tanks, ammunition, food, medicine, aircraft, vehicles, everything. The logistics weapon wasn't the ship itself, It was the system that produced it. Richmond Shipyard No. 2 employed 90,000 workers at peak capacity. They worked 3 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The shipyard launched a ship every 5 days. For 3 years. That's not a miracle. That's industrial output. Chapter 7. The Fire Mission Arithmetic. Artillery at Normandy. The fire mission log is filed under After Action Reports, 2nd Infantry Division, July 1944, page 114. The entry is dated July 9th, St. Lo, France. A forward observer, Lieutenant Charles Hangsturfer, the same sergeant from Kasserine Pass, now promoted and reassigned, calls in a fire mission at 1300 hours. The radio transcript reads, Fire Mission, Victor Terre 3, Grid 409273, Troops in open, request time on target. Within 90 seconds, 18 separate artillery batteries responded. 216 shells landed within a 40-meter radius. The log notes, target destroyed, no visual confirmation needed. That's not artillery. That's industrial mathematics applied to killing. Artillery doesn't feature prominently in popular histories of World War II. People remember D-Day as a beach assault. They remember tanks rolling through France. They remember bomber formations over Germany. Artillery is background noise, literally. But the statistics tell a different story. American artillery killed more German soldiers than any other weapon system. More than rifles, more than tanks, more than aircraft. During the 77-day Normandy campaign, U.S. artillery fired 9,476,800 rounds. That's an average of 123,076 rounds per day, or 5,128 rounds per hour, or 85 rounds per minute, continuously, for 11 weeks. Each shell weighed 95 pounds. That's 5.8 tons of steel arriving per minute, 24 hours a day. The weapon was the M101 105mm howitzer. It was the standard divisional artillery piece, reliable and boring. Range, 11,000 meters. Rate of fire, 4 rounds per minute sustained, 8 rounds per minute surge. A single M101 battery consisted of 6 guns. A standard U.S. infantry division had 3 battalions of M101s, 54 guns total. By August 1944, there were 16 U.S. divisions in France. That's 864 divisional artillery pieces, not counting corps-level heavy artillery or self-propelled guns. The Germans had artillery too, but they didn't have the system. The American system was the Fire Direction Center, abbreviated FDC. It was invented at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in 1941 by a group of artillery officers who'd studied British and German methods and concluded both were inefficient. German artillery doctrine required officers to manually calculate firing solutions for each mission, measuring range, windage, elevation, and propellant temperature. It was accurate but slow. A trained German artillery officer could calculate a fire mission in 8 minutes. American FDC operators, enlisted men, not officers, could do it in 45 seconds. The difference was pre-calculated firing tables. The FDC system worked like this. A forward observer radioed a target's grid coordinates. The FDC operator found those coordinates on a graphical firing chart, essentially a large map with transparent overlays showing range rings for each gun battery. The operator identified which batteries could reach the target, consulted pre-printed ballistic tables, adjusted for wind and temperature, and transmitted firing data to the gun crews. The entire process, from radio call to first shell fired, took less than 2 minutes. Multiple batteries could converge fire on a single target without ever seeing each other or the target. This was time-on-target fire, scheduling shells from different locations to arrive simultaneously, overwhelming a target before it could disperse. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the destroyer USS Frankfurt began firing time-on-target missions at 0730 hours, coordinating with forward observers who hadn't even landed yet. The fire missions were pre-planned, based on aerial reconnaissance and maps. The Frankfurt fired on suspected German strongpoints inland from Omaha Beach, using coordinates provided by observers still offshore. This shouldn't have worked. Naval gunfire and land artillery operated on different coordinate systems, used different ballistic tables, and had no shared radio protocols. But the U.S. Navy and Army had spent 6 months at Fort Sill training together. synchronizing systems, standardizing formats. When the landing began, naval guns and field artillery fired as a single system. The Germans had never seen anything like it. When I was comparing German after-action reports with U.S. artillery logs, I found it troubling how often perception diverges from reality. The German 7th Army's War Diary, captured in August 1944, describes unending artillery fire and estimates American guns outnumbered German guns 10-1. The actual ratio was 3-1. The German perception of overwhelming firepower came from coordination, not quantity. A single target might receive fire from 6 batteries, 36 guns, within seconds. To the Germans receiving that fire, it felt like 100 guns. It wasn't. It was 6 batteries with synchronized watches and shared coordinates. The logistics were staggering. A single M101 shell weighed 95 pounds, including propellant. A sustained fire mission, 4 rounds per gun per minute, required 380 pounds of ammunition per minute per gun. Multiply that by 54 guns per division, 16 divisions in theater, and you get 327,600 pounds of ammunition consumed per minute at maximum rate. That's 163 tons per minute. The supply chain delivering that ammunition involved trucks, trains, ships, depots, and thousands of men whose names appear in no history books. Artillery didn't win through firepower. It won through logistics. In July 1944, during the Battle for St. Lo, a single U.S. artillery battalion, the 58th Armored Field Artillery, fired 5,000 rounds in 24 hours. That's more than an entire German artillery division's monthly allocation. German gunners weren't incompetent. They were rationed. By mid-1944, the Wehrmacht's ammunition production couldn't keep pace with expenditure. German batteries fired conservatively, saving shells for critical moments. American batteries fired continuously, because they could. The Allies controlled the Atlantic sea lanes. American factories produced ammunition faster than frontline units could fire it. Logistics determined firepower. Firepower determined battles. Here's a statistic that doesn't get mentioned enough. During the Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, U.S. and British artillery achieved 92% accuracy using time-on-target missions. 92%. That means 92 out of every 100 shells landed within 50 meters of the intended target. German counter-battery fire, artillery targeting enemy artillery, achieved 34% accuracy during the same period. The difference wasn't the guns. Both sides used similar howitzers with comparable range and lethality. The difference was the FDC system. German artillery relied on individual gun crews calculating their own firing solutions. American artillery relied on centralized calculation and distributed execution. Centralization won. It fascinates me how often popular history treats artillery as a supporting weapon when, statistically, it was the primary killer. Studies conducted by the U.S. Army's Operational Research Office after the war, published in 1952 but rarely cited, concluded that artillery caused 75% of German casualties in the European theater. Not rifles, not tank guns, artillery. The percentage for American casualties caused by German artillery was lower, 61%. The asymmetry came from American artillery's higher volume and better coordination. More shells, better targeting, faster response. The Germans fought bravely. They fought under constant bombardment. Lieutenant Hangsterfer's fire mission log from July 19, 1944, contains a handwritten note at the bottom. Requested fire mission at 1400 hours. Shells arriving 1402. This still feels like cheating. Hangsterfer had been at Kasserine Pass, where American artillery had been slow, uncoordinated, and ineffective. 18 months later, he could call in a fire mission and watch 18 batteries respond in 2 minutes. The improvement wasn't training, it was system design. The U.S. Army had built an industrial process for delivering high-explosive shells to precise coordinates faster than any other army in history. Hangsterfer called it cheating. The Germans called it hell. Chapter 8. The Memo That Broke Germany. Oil, not morale. The memo is classified urgent, typed on thin paper, dated April 19, 1944. Enemy Objectives Unit Memo Number 42. The recipient, General Carl Spaatz, Commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. The subject line reads, Recommendation for immediate priority targeting of synthetic oil facilities. The text is dense, economic analysis mixed with intelligence estimates. The critical paragraph is on page 3. German petroleum reserves estimated at 3 months current consumption. Immobilization of Wehrmacht ground forces achievable before invasion if synthetic production facilities targeted immediately. Window of opportunity, 60 days. The memo was written by WW2, a 37-year-old economist working in a basement office at the Office of Strategic Services. Rostow had never flown in a bomber, never seen combat, never visited Germany, but he'd read the German industrial production reports captured by Allied intelligence, and he'd done the math. Germany was about to run out of war. Strategic bombing in World War II is usually described as a moral question. Was it justified to bomb cities and kill civilians? That's an important question. But it's not the question that ended the war. The question that ended the war was, what do you bomb? For 3 years, from 1941 to 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force bombed German cities, factories, rail yards, and dams. The results were unimpressive. German war production increased every year. In 1942, Germany produced 9,300 tanks. In 1943, 12,000. In 1944, 19,000. Strategic bombing wasn't stopping Germany, it was irritating Germany. The problem was target selection. The British favored area bombing, dropping incendiary bombs on cities to destroy worker housing and break civilian morale. The Americans favored precision bombing, hitting specific factories, rail junctions, and industrial sites. Both strategies assumed that destroying production capacity would cripple Germany's ability to fight. Both strategies were wrong, because both misunderstood how modern industrial economies work. Factories can be rebuilt, workers can be relocated, production can be dispersed, but supply chains can't be improvised. If you destroy the inputs, the raw materials required for production, the factories become irrelevant. Germany's critical input wasn't steel or coal, it was oil. Germany in 1944 produced almost no natural petroleum. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiesti supplied 33% of German oil. Synthetic oil plants, facilities that converted coal into liquid fuel using the Fischer-Tropsch and Burgess processes, supplied the rest. These plants were technological marvels, requiring massive infrastructure and thousands of workers. They were also irreplaceable. If you destroyed a synthetic oil plant, Germany couldn't just build a new one in 3 months. Rebuilding required 2 years, specialized equipment, and resources Germany didn't have. Rostow's analysis identified 23 critical synthetic oil facilities. If those facilities were destroyed, German oil production would collapse. German tanks, trucks, and aircraft would become immobile. The Wehrmacht would starve for fuel. The first large-scale raid on synthetic oil infrastructure occurred on May 12, 1944. The target? The Luna synthetic oil plant near Merseburg, Germany. 935 B-17 bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustang fighters, dropped 1,714 tons of bombs. The plant's output dropped 80%. German repair crews worked around the clock. Within 18 days, the plant was producing at 50% capacity. The Americans returned on May 28th. Output dropped to 20%. Another raid on June 20th. Output dropped to 5%. The plant never recovered. By August, Luna, which had produced 300,000 tons of synthetic fuel in 1943, produced 8,000 tons. The arithmetic was simple. Germany needed fuel. America could destroy fuel production faster than Germany could repair it. When I was reading through the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey reports, published in 1946, but based on interrogations and captured documents from 1945, I was struck by how often German officials cited fuel shortages as the cause of military collapse. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, told his interrogators that he informed Adolf Hitler in June 1944 that fuel shortages would make defense impossible by September. Hitler ignored him. By September, German tank production was still high, nearly 600 tanks per week, but fuel production had dropped 90%. Factories were building tanks that couldn't move. On the Eastern Front, German panzer divisions were being towed to the front by horses. In the mechanized war. The clearest proof of the oil campaign's effectiveness came in December 1944. the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West. Panzer divisions advanced 50 miles into Belgium, catching American forces by surprise. Then they stopped. Not because of American resistance, though that was significant. They stopped because they ran out of fuel. Captured German operational orders, now stored at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, show that German commanders assigned objectives based on fuel availability, not strategic value. Units were ordered to capture Allied fuel dumps because German logistics couldn't supply them. When those fuel dumps weren't captured, the offensive stalled. Panzer divisions, vehicles capable of traveling 300 kilometers, sat immobile after advancing 80 kilometers. The Wehrmacht didn't lose the Battle of the Bulge. It ran out of gas. Ploiești, the Romanian oil fields, fell to Soviet forces on August 30, 1944. Germany lost its last major source of natural petroleum. Synthetic oil production, already crippled by bombing, couldn't compensate. In 1943, Germany produced 5,460,000 tons of petroleum products, both natural and synthetic. In 1944, after oil bombing began in May, production dropped to 1,020,000 tons. In the first quarter of 1945, production dropped to 280,000 tons. The decline wasn't gradual. It was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht in January 1945 was mechanically equivalent to the Wehrmacht of 1918. Infantry on foot, artillery pulled by horses, and a handful of tanks operating on fumes. The technical challenge of oil bombing was precision. Synthetic oil plants were compact, heavily defended, and surrounded by civilian infrastructure. Early raids achieved poor accuracy. Fewer than 10% of bombs landed within the target area. But by mid-1944, the introduction of P-51 Mustang long-range fighters changed the equation. Mustangs escorted bombers all the way to the target, suppressing German flak batteries and engaging Luftwaffe interceptors. With fighter protection, bombers could fly lower, bomb more accurately, and loiter longer over the target. Accuracy improved to 40% by July 1944. 40% doesn't sound impressive until you calculate tonnage. If 400 bombers each drop 2 tons of bombs, and 40% hit the target, that's 320 tons of high explosives, hitting a facility designed for chemical production, not bombardment. Synthetic oil plants weren't fortified. They were industrial complexes full of pipes, boilers, and catalytic reactors. A few direct hits could shut down production for weeks. To me, the most frustrating part of this story is the timing. The Enemy Objectives Unit identified oil as Germany's critical vulnerability in April 1944. But the U.S. Army Air Forces didn't prioritize oil bombing until May. Why the delay? Bureaucratic inertia. The Air Force had spent 3 years bombing factories, cities, and rail yards. Changing targeting priorities meant admitting those earlier efforts had been less effective than claimed. It meant reassigning bomber groups, retraining crews, and revising strategic doctrine. Military institutions resist change. By the time oil bombing became the priority, it was May 1944. If the campaign had started in January, or even better, in 1943, the war might have ended before D-Day. Germany would have been immobilized. The invasion could have walked in. Albert Speer's interrogation transcript, dated May 15, 1945, contains this exchange. When did you know Germany would lose? Speer: June 1944, when you destroyed Luna. After that, it was arithmetic. The interrogator asks, why didn't you tell Hitler? Speer: I did. He said we would develop new weapons. He meant the V2 rocket. The V2 rocket program consumed 13 tons of strategic materials per missile and killed an average of 2 people per launch. A single Tiger II tank consumed 40 tons of materials and could destroy 20 to 30 enemy tanks. Germany built 6,000 V2 rockets and 492 Tiger IIs. Resource allocation wasn't just inefficient, it was delusional. The oil campaign didn't defeat Germany. Germany defeated itself by building rockets instead of tanks, then ran out of fuel for both. Chapter 9. The Pharmacology Front, Penicillin and the Death Rate. The requisition form is dated June 8, 1944. Stamped at the top, Operation Overlord, Medical Supply, Priority Alpha. The request, 500,000 units of penicillin for estimated D-Day casualties. Someone has written in the margin, in blue ink, this is 40% of global supply. The form is signed by Brigadier General Paul Hawley, Chief Surgeon of the European Theater of Operations. Below Hawley's signature, a second note: approved, but production must triple by July. It didn't triple by July. It quintupled. Penicillin production in the United States went from 21 billion units in January 1944 to 650 billion units by December. That increase wasn't medical innovation. It was industrial engineering applied to fungus. Penicillin is famous as the first antibiotic, discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, when he noticed that mold killed bacteria in a petri dish. What's less famous is that penicillin was useless for 16 years after its discovery. Fleming couldn't produce enough of it. The mold, Penicillium notatum, grew slowly, yielded tiny amounts of active compound, and died if conditions weren't perfect. By 1940, Fleming had produced enough penicillin to treat fewer than 10 patients. A medical curiosity, nothing more. Then the war started, and British researchers Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain realized penicillin might save lives if someone could figure out how to make it in quantity. Britain couldn't. British pharmaceutical companies were small-scale operations, focused on tablets and tinctures. Industrial fermentation, growing microbes in massive tanks, wasn't a British specialty, so Florey went to America. In July 1941, Florey met with executives at Pfizer, Merck, and Squibb, America's largest pharmaceutical manufacturers. He brought a vial of penicillium mold and a request. Could American companies scale penicillin production from milligrams to kilograms? Pfizer said yes. The company had been experimenting with deep tank fermentation for citric acid production. The process involved growing microbes in 10,000-gallon steel tanks, pumping in air and nutrients, then harvesting the output. Pfizer's engineers believed the same process could work for penicillium. They were correct. By March 1942, Pfizer's Brooklyn plant was producing penicillin in 2,000-gallon tanks. Yield, 2,000 units per liter. That was 100 times better than Fleming's lab-scale process. It wasn't good enough. The challenge was the mold. Penicillium notatum was finicky. It grew slowly, required specific temperatures, and produced inconsistent yields. The U.S. Department of Agriculture launched a global search for better mold strains. Researchers tested soil samples from every continent. The winning strain came from a moldy cantaloupe purchased at a Peoria, Illinois grocery store in 1943. The cantaloupe mold, Penicillium chrysogenum, grew faster, tolerated temperature variation, and produced 6 times more penicillin than Fleming's original strain. It was also more stable under industrial fermentation. By June 1943, Pfizer's tanks were using the cantaloupe strain. Yield increased to 12,000 units per liter. By January 1944, 25,000 units per liter. By June, 50,000. By December, 100,000. A 5,000% increase in 18 months. The technical breakthrough wasn't microbiology, it was chemical engineering. Growing penicillium in 10,000-gallon tanks required precise control of temperature, oxygen, pH, and nutrient concentration. Too much oxygen, and the mold died. Too little, and it stopped producing penicillin. Pfizer's engineers developed automated systems to monitor and adjust tank conditions in real time. They also figured out how to extract penicillin from the fermentation broth without killing the mold, allowing continuous production instead of batch processing. These weren't medical discoveries. They were industrial optimizations. Pfizer treated penicillin like a chemical product, not a miracle drug. The miracle was the production line. When I was reviewing the War Production Board's pharmaceutical records, archived at the National Archives but rarely cited, I found it striking how much penicillin production resembled weapons manufacturing. The WPB allocated steel for fermentation tanks the same way it allocated steel for Liberty ships, by tonnage and priority. Penicillin was classified as a critical war material, equivalent to aluminum or rubber. Pharmaceutical companies received priority access to raw materials: corn steep liquor for nutrients, lactose for culture medium, steel for tanks, ahead of civilian industries. By mid-1944, 22 U.S. pharmaceutical companies were producing penicillin. Total capacity, 1 trillion units per year. That was enough to treat every wounded Allied soldier with 50,000 units, a full course of therapy. German production, 0. Germany never mass-produced penicillin. It's not that German scientists didn't understand antibiotics. They did. German pharmaceutical giant IG Farben had been researching sulfa drugs, a different class of antibiotics, since the 1930s. Sulfa drugs worked, but not as well as penicillin. They caused side effects, required higher doses, and were less effective against certain infections. But sulfa drugs were easier to synthesize chemically. Penicillin required biological fermentation, which German industry wasn't equipped to do at scale. So, Germany stuck with sulfa drugs. The result? A 20% survival rate advantage for Allied soldiers with infected wounds compared to German soldiers. 20% doesn't sound large until you multiply it by casualties. Over the course of the war, penicillin saved an estimated 150,000 Allied lives. That's more than died at Normandy. The first civilian use of penicillin in the United States was in November 1942. A victim of the Coconut Grove nightclub fire in Boston received penicillin treatment for burns and sepsis. He survived. The case made headlines. Demand for civilian penicillin skyrocketed. The War Production Board banned civilian sales. Every dose of penicillin produced between January 1943 and August 1945 was reserved for military use. Civilians died of infections that penicillin could have cured because soldiers needed it more. Dr. Chester Kiefer, appointed penicillin czar by the WPB, personally approved every non-military dose. His records, archived at Boston University, show he approved fewer than 1,000 civilian treatments during the entire war. Triage wasn't a battlefield concept. It was a pharmaceutical policy. Here's a statistic that should be better known. In World War I, the mortality rate for soldiers with infected wounds was 40%. In World War II, it was 3%. The difference wasn't surgical technique, it was antibiotics. American medics in Normandy carried penicillin in their field kits, 2,000 units per ampule, enough for initial treatment. Soldiers with infected wounds received penicillin within hours of injury, preventing sepsis before it became lethal. German medics carried sulfa powder. It helped. It wasn't penicillin. German field hospitals reported sepsis as the leading cause of death among wounded soldiers. American field hospitals reported it as the third leading cause, after hemorrhage and traumatic brain injury. Penicillin didn't just save lives, it changed the nature of battlefield medicine. To me, the darkest irony is that penicillin was discovered by a British scientist, scaled by American industry, and used almost exclusively by Allied militaries. German civilians, British civilians, American civilians, they all suffered from bacterial infections during the war. They all could have benefited from penicillin. But penicillin was rationed for soldiers. The pharmacology front wasn't about saving lives in general. It was about saving specific lives, the lives of men who could return to combat. Medicine became a weapons system. The Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, was suspended for the duration. Kiefer's records don't show regret. They show efficiency. He allocated penicillin where it would preserve combat effectiveness. Civilians could wait until the war ended. Most did. Some didn't. Chapter 10. The Unbuilt Fortress, Why Germany Couldn't Defend. The transcript is typed on thin paper, 53 pages, stamped "Secret" on every page. United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Interrogation of Albert Speer, May 15, 1945. The interrogator is John Kenneth Galbraith, economist, later famous but in 1945 just another analyst trying to understand how Germany lost. Page 47 contains this exchange. Could Germany have produced more tanks? Speer: yes, we could have built 1,000 more Panthers in 1944. Galbraith: why didn't you? Speer: we built 500 more V2 rockets instead. Hitler preferred rockets. They killed 2,754 people. Panthers could have stopped your advance. There's a handwritten note in the margin, probably Galbraith's. Insane resource allocation. Albert Speer was appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production in February 1942, after his predecessor died in a plane crash. Speer was an architect, not an industrialist. He designed buildings for the Nazi Party, including the Reich Chancellery and the Nuremberg rally grounds. He knew nothing about manufacturing, but he was competent, which in the Nazi regime was rare enough to matter. Speer's first action was to centralize production planning. Before 1942, the Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe, and SS each controlled their own supply chains, competing for resources and refusing to share production data. Speer forced them to report to a single authority, him. German tank production increased immediately, from 9,300 tanks in 1942 to 12,000 in 1943 to 19,000 in 1944. Speer called it rationalization. It was just basic management, but rationalization had limits. The Nazi regime wasn't structured for efficiency. It was structured for ideological purity and personal loyalty to Hitler. Every decision required Hitler's approval, and Hitler's decisions were often irrational. In January 1943, Speer requested steel allocations for tank production. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, refused, diverting steel to aircraft production instead. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, demanded resources for concentration camps, not for war production, but for extermination. The regime's priorities were murder and prestige, not military effectiveness. Speer couldn't override Hitler, and Hitler wouldn't override Göring or Himmler. So German industry produced what the regime wanted, not what the Wehrmacht needed. The V-2 rocket program is the clearest example of this dysfunction. The V-2 was a liquid-fueled ballistic missile, technologically impressive and strategically useless. Each rocket cost 100,000 Reichsmarks, equivalent to 4 Panzer IV tanks. Each rocket carried 1 ton of explosives, equivalent to 10 artillery shells. The V-2 killed an average of 2 people per launch. A Panzer IV, in combat, killed an average of 20 to 30 enemy soldiers before being destroyed. The V-2 was a propaganda weapon. Hitler ordered it into production because he believed wonder weapons would reverse Germany's declining military position. Speer argued against it. Hitler ignored him. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched 3,000 V-2 rockets at London and Antwerp. Total casualties, 7,250. Total resources consumed, enough to build 1,200 tanks or 30,000 trucks. When I was cross-referencing Speer's interrogation transcripts with German production records, captured by Allied forces and archived at the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, I was struck by how often Nazi ideology sabotaged military logic. The regime refused to fully mobilize women for factory work because Nazi propaganda idealized women as homemakers. German factories operated on a single shift, 8 hours per day, until 1944, because extending shifts would harm German morale. Meanwhile, American and British factories ran 3 shifts, 24 hours per day. Soviet factories ran continuously, with workers sleeping beside their machines. Germany lost the production war because it refused to fight it like a war. The numbers are damning. In 1944, Germany produced 19,000 tanks. The United States produced 17,234 M4 Shermans that year, nearly equal output. But the U.S. also produced 47,000 aircraft, 11,000 locomotives, 2,710 Liberty ships, and 639,245 jeeps. Germany produced 25,000 aircraft, a few hundred locomotives, and 56,000 military vehicles total. The disparity wasn't industrial capacity. Germany had massive industrial infrastructure, Krupp steelworks, IG Farben chemical plants, Daimler-Benz factories. The disparity was organizational. American industry was centrally coordinated by the War Production Board. German industry was fragmented among competing Nazi fiefdoms. Speer's interrogation reveals another failure: labor. German factories relied heavily on forced labor. Concentration camp prisoners, Soviet POWs, and conscripted workers from occupied territories. Forced labor is inefficient. Workers who are starved, beaten, and worked to death don't produce quality goods. Speer admitted that forced labor productivity was 30% lower than voluntary German labor. But the Nazi regime couldn't recruit voluntary labor from occupied territories because its racial ideology classified Slavs and Jews as subhuman. So Germany used forced labor, knowing it was less efficient because ideology prevented alternatives. The result? More workers, less output. The Tiger II tank, Germany's most advanced tank, illustrates this perfectly. The Tiger II weighed 69 tons, carried an 88mm gun, and had armor thick enough to defeat any Allied tank gun at range. It was mechanically reliable, strategically impressive, and logistically catastrophic. Each Tiger II required 300,000 man-hours to build, An M4 Sherman required 10,000 man-hours. Germany built 492 Tiger IIs during the entire war. The US built 49,234 Shermans. German quality was a liability. The Wehrmacht needed thousands of adequate tanks, not hundreds of superior ones. Speer understood this. He proposed simplifying tank designs to increase production. Hitler refused. Hitler wanted the best tank in the world. He got it. It didn't matter. Here's the statistic that encapsulates Germany's industrial failure. By February 1945, German factories were producing more tanks per month than at any point in the war. 540 tanks in February alone. But those tanks couldn't leave the factories. There was no fuel to run them, no trains to transport them, and no replacement crews to man them. Production increased while capability collapsed. Speer told his interrogators, "We were building a military for a war that had already ended." The factories kept running because shutting them down would require admitting defeat, and the Nazi regime couldn't admit defeat. So workers built tanks that sat in factory yards, waiting for fuel that never arrived. To me, the most revealing moment in Speer's interrogation comes on page 51. Galbraith asks, "When did you know Germany would lose?" Speer, 1943, after Stalingrad, but I couldn't say so. Anyone who suggested defeat was executed. Galbraith, so you kept building? Speer, I kept building. That's the entire story. The Nazi regime knew it was losing, but couldn't admit it, so it kept producing weapons it couldn't use, fighting battles it couldn't win, and sacrificing lives it couldn't replace. Germany didn't lose because of Allied superiority. Germany lost because its own system was incapable of rational decision-making. The industrial war was over before the Wehrmacht surrendered. The shooting just continued for 2 more years. Chapter 11. The Pacific Equation. Island Hopping as Industrial Logic. The logistics table is dated August 7, 1943. Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet Headquarters, Pearl Harbor. The document is titled Comparative Resource Analysis, Assault versus Bypass Strategy. 2 columns. Left column, Direct Assault on Rabaul. Estimated casualties, 18,000. Estimated days of supply required, 140. Right column, Bypass Rabaul. Neutralize via air and naval blockade. Estimated casualties, 0. Days of supply required, 0. At the bottom of the page, someone, likely Admiral Raymond Spruance, based on the handwriting, has written, Bypass, save lives, save logistics. Rabaul, Japan's largest base in the South Pacific, was never invaded. 27,856 Japanese troops were stationed there. They never fought. They starved. Island hopping is taught as a brilliant strategy. The narrative goes, Douglas MacArthur and Chester Nimitz devised a plan to bypass heavily fortified Japanese islands, isolating them instead of assaulting them, leapfrogging toward Japan while conserving American lives. That narrative is partially accurate and entirely misleading. Island hopping wasn't genius, it was triage. The United States didn't have enough ships, men, or supplies to invade every Japanese-held island in the Pacific. So, American planners did math. They calculated which islands provided strategic value, airfields, harbors, supply depots, and which islands could be ignored. Islands with strategic value were invaded. Islands without were blockaded. The Japanese forces on bypassed islands didn't surrender. They just became irrelevant. The numbers explain the decision. The Pacific Theater covered 64 million square miles of ocean. Japan controlled approximately 15,000 islands across that expanse. Most islands had no strategic significance, but Japan had fortified many of them anyway, stationing garrisons that ranged from a few hundred to tens of thousands of troops. In November 1943, American planners at CINCPAC headquarters calculated the cost of invading every fortified Japanese island between Hawaii and Tokyo. The estimate? 500,000 casualties, 3 years, and logistical resources equivalent to supplying 2 European invasions. The alternative? Invade only the islands that provided logistical stepping stones, bypass the rest. Estimated casualties, 150,000. Time, 18 months. The math was obvious. The Battle of Tarawa demonstrated why. Tarawa was a tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands, 2 miles long, half a mile wide. Japan had fortified it with 4,000, 836 troops, and extensive concrete bunkers. On November 20th, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Tarawa. The battle lasted 76 hours. American casualties, 3,407, including 1,696 dead. Japanese casualties, 4,690, nearly all dead. The Marines captured an island that provided minimal strategic value. Admiral Nimitz's staff calculated the ratio. For every mile of captured island, the U.S. lost 1,700 men. At that rate, capturing the 2,000 miles between Tarawa and Tokyo would cost 3.4 million casualties. The invasion of Japan would be even worse, so the strategy changed. When I was reading Spruance's planning notes, archived at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, I found it striking how explicitly he describes island hopping as logistical triage. His notes from December 1943 contain detailed calculations. The fuel required to transport troops to Rabaul versus the fuel required to maintain a blockade. The medical supplies needed for estimated casualties versus the supplies needed for ongoing operations. The ship tonnage required for invasion versus the tonnage required for regular supply runs. In every calculation, bypassing Rabaul was more efficient. Spruance writes, "We do not need Rabaul. We only need to ensure Japan doesn't use Rabaul. Blockade achieves the same result at 1/10 the cost." The decision wasn't moral, it was arithmetic. The blockade strategy worked because of the U.S. Navy's fleet train. The fleet train was a logistics concept, using auxiliary ships, oilers, ammunition ships, repair ships, hospital ships, supply ships, to resupply combat vessels at sea, eliminating the need for forward bases. In 1944, the U.S. Pacific Fleet operated with 421 auxiliary vessels supporting combat operations. The Japanese combined fleet had 83. That 4-to-1 ratio meant American carriers could operate 6,000 miles from Pearl Harbor, launching strikes against Japanese-held islands without returning to port. Japanese carriers needed forward bases for resupply. When the U.S. bypassed those bases, Japanese carriers became tethered to shrinking supply lines. Truk Lagoon, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, was bypassed in February 1944. Truk held 27,600 Japanese troops, extensive fortifications, and a deep-water harbor capable of supporting the entire combined fleet. American planners considered invasion. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, estimated casualties at 15,000 to 20,000. Instead, the U.S. launched Operation Hailstone, a carrier-based air raid that destroyed Japanese aircraft and shipping at Truk without landing a single Marine. The raid lasted 3 days. American losses, 25 aircraft. Japanese losses, 270 aircraft, 44 ships, and the operational use of Truk as a forward base. After Hailstone, Truk's garrison was isolated. They received no supplies, no reinforcements, and no orders. They simply waited for the war to end. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Of the 1.7 million Japanese troops stationed across the Pacific, 340,000, 20%, never engaged American forces. They were bypassed. Some starved. Some died of disease. Some survived until August 1945 and surrendered when Japan capitulated. But they didn't fight because the U.S. never gave them the opportunity. The Americans didn't defeat those troops. They made them irrelevant. Strategically, it was brilliant. Morally, it's complicated. Those Japanese soldiers weren't killed in combat. They were killed by logistics, or more precisely, by the absence of logistics. Blockaded islands received no food, no medicine, no ammunition. Soldiers died slowly, pointlessly, waiting for a relief that never came. The Saipan invasion in June 1944 illustrates how supply lines determined battles. Saipan held 31,000 Japanese troops and was considered a critical target. Its airfields could support B-29 bombers striking Japan. The U.S. invaded with 71,000 Marines and soldiers. Captured Japanese supply logs, now archived at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, show Saipan's garrison had 47 days of food and 23 days of ammunition when the invasion began. The battle lasted 25 days. The Japanese fought ferociously, but they fought on diminishing supplies. American forces had unlimited resupply. Ships arrived daily with ammunition, food, water, and fuel. The Japanese had what they'd stockpiled. When their ammunition ran out, they charged with bayonets. They lost. Not because of inferior tactics, but because logistics had already decided the outcome before the first shot was fired. To me, the most telling statistic is this. The U.S. bypassed 105,000 Japanese troops across the Pacific. Rabaul, Truk, Wewak, Bougainville, and dozens of smaller garrisons. Those troops never fought. They were defeated by being ignored. The strategy wasn't merciful. It was efficient. Every bypassed island was one less invasion, one less casualty list, one less logistical burden. The Pacific War is remembered for battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Brutal, bloody, famous. But the war was won by the islands that were never invaded, the battles that were never fought, the enemies who were neutralized by hunger and isolation instead of firepower. That's not heroism. It's industrial warfare. Victory through resource management, not valor. Chapter 12. The Untold Air War. Why B-17s Didn't Matter. The report is 212 pages long, single-spaced, stamped "Restricted" on the cover. United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Report Number 4, published September 1945. Section 3, Paragraph 6. German war production increased 40% between 1942 and 1944, despite sustained strategic bombing. Area bombing campaigns did not reduce industrial output, they dispersed it. The author is John Kenneth Galbraith, the same economist who interrogated Albert Speer. Galbraith's conclusion, buried on page 187, is devastating. Strategic bombing of German cities had negligible impact on war production before mid-1944. Precision bombing of oil and transportation infrastructure in the final year of the war contributed significantly to German collapse. Prior efforts were largely ineffective. The B-17 Flying Fortress is one of World War II's iconic symbols. 4 engines, bristling with machine guns, dropping bombs on Nazi Germany from 25,000 feet. The B-17 represented American industrial power and moral certainty. Precision bombing would destroy Germany's war machine without resorting to the barbarism of German blitzkrieg tactics. That's the myth. The reality is uglier. The B-17 killed 12,732 American airmen, cost billions of dollars to produce and operate, and achieved minimal strategic results until the final year of the war. The B-17 didn't win the air war. The P-51 Mustang fighter did, and even then, it wasn't the planes that mattered. It was what they targeted. Strategic bombing doctrine in 1942 was based on a theory. If you destroyed Germany's factories, Germany couldn't build weapons. If Germany couldn't build weapons, Germany would lose. The theory was logical. It was also wrong, because it misunderstood industrial resilience. Factories can be rebuilt, production can be dispersed, workers can be relocated. The U.S. Army Air Forces spent 3 years proving this the hard way. Between January 1942 and June 1944, American and British bombers flew 287,000 sorties against German cities, factories, and industrial sites. They dropped 1,554,463 tons of bombs. German war production increased every year, not despite the bombing, because of it. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid on August 17, 1943, was supposed to be decisive. The target? Ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, critical for tank and aircraft production. The theory? Destroy the ball bearings, paralyze German industry. 376 B-17s took off. 60 bombers were shot down. 600 aircrew were killed or captured. The ball-bearing plants were damaged. German production recovered in 6 weeks by importing Swedish ball bearings and dispersing production to multiple smaller facilities. The raid achieved nothing permanent, but it killed 600 men and destroyed 60 aircraft that cost $188,000 each, $11.2 million in losses, for no strategic gain. When I was reviewing bombing survey data, compiled by interviewing German industrial managers after the war, I found it troubling how much effort was wasted. Albert Speer's production statistics, corroborated by captured German records, show that tank production increased from 9,300 in 1942 to 12,000 in 1943 to 19,000 in 1944. Aircraft production increased from 15,000 in 1942 to to 25,000 in 1944. Ammunition production increased every year until February 1945. Strategic bombing didn't cripple German industry. It annoyed it. Factories were rebuilt, often in underground facilities or dispersed across smaller sites that were harder to target. Bombing created disruption, not collapse. The problem was accuracy. The Norden bomb sight, installed in every B-17, was advertised as capable of dropping a bomb into a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet. That was theoretical accuracy, calculated in perfect conditions with no flak, no fighters, and clear skies. Operational accuracy was different. Studies conducted after the war showed that the average bombing error from 20,000 feet was 1,200 feet. That's a quarter mile. Precision bombing wasn't precise. Most bombs missed their targets entirely, hitting empty fields or residential neighborhoods. Of the 1,554,000 tons dropped on Germany before mid-1944, fewer than 200,000 tons hit militarily significant targets. The rest, 87.5%, were wasted. The exception was oil. In May 1944, the 8th Air Force shifted targeting priorities from cities and factories to petroleum production and transportation infrastructure. The change was immediate and devastating. German oil production dropped 90% within 6 months. The Wehrmacht ran out of fuel, tanks couldn't move, aircraft couldn't fly, trucks sat idle. The bombing campaign that mattered, the campaign that actually ended the war, lasted from May 1944 to April 1945. 11 months. Everything before that was, statistically, ineffective. Here's the uncomfortable comparison. The B-17 dropped 1,554,000 tons of bombs on Germany. Of that, 1,360,000 tons, 87.5%, were area bombing with no specific military target. The remaining 194,000 tons, mostly targeting oil and rail infrastructure after May 1944, contributed significantly to German collapse. The B-17's contribution to victory was the final 13% of its effort. The other 87% killed civilians, destroyed cities, and consumed resources without strategic gain. The P-51 Mustang, by contrast, was designed to escort bombers. It had the range to accompany B-17s all the way to targets deep in Germany, engaging Luftwaffe interceptors before they reached the bombers. But the Mustang's real contribution wasn't escort duty. It was fighter sweeps. P-51s hunted German aircraft, on the ground and in the air. Between January and June 1944, P-51s destroyed more German aircraft than B-17s destroyed on the ground. The Mustang won air superiority, which made subsequent bombing raids possible. The bomber didn't win the air war. The fighter did. It fascinates me how much post-war narratives distort this. The U.S. Air Force, which became independent in 1947, needed to justify strategic bombing as a war-winning strategy. The alternative, admitting that 3 years of bombing had minimal impact, would undermine the case for an independent Air Force. So the narrative became, strategic bombing broke German morale, crippled industry, and won the war. The Strategic Bombing Survey's actual findings were quietly shelved. Galbraith's conclusion, that strategic bombing was mostly ineffective, was ignored. The myth persisted because institutions needed it to. To me, the most damning detail is the casualty ratio. 12,732 American airmen died flying B-17s. The average bomber crew completed 25 missions before rotation. But the average bomber crew didn't complete 25 missions. The loss rate was too high. A B-17 crew had a 35% chance of being killed before reaching the 25 mission threshold. They flew knowing the odds. Many didn't come back. They were heroes. But heroism doesn't validate strategy. The men who died flying B-17s deserved better tactics. Chapter 13. The Invisible Army, African American Logistics Troops. The Convoy Manifest is dated August 30th, 1944. Red Ball Express, Route 7, Chartres to Verdun. 132 trucks carrying 396 tons of fuel and ammunition. The driver roster lists 132 names. All of them, every single one, belong to black soldiers from segregated quartermaster truck companies. At the bottom of the manifest, a receiving signature, Major George S. Patton, Jr., Third Army. Patton's memoirs, published in 1947, describe his lightning advance across France and credit his superior logistics. The memoirs never mention that 75% of the truck drivers who made that advance possible were black soldiers Patton's army wouldn't allow to eat in the same mess halls as white troops. The Red Ball Express was activated on August 25, 1944, 6 days after the liberation of Paris. The problem was simple. Patton's Third Army was advancing faster than supply lines could follow. The army had planned for a methodical advance, liberating French towns, securing supply depots, building infrastructure. Patton ignored the plan. His tanks raced east, covering 80 kilometers per day, outrunning their own logistics. By late August, Third Army units were immobilized, not by German resistance, but by empty fuel tanks. Patton needed 5,000 tons of supplies delivered daily. The existing supply system could manage 1,500. The solution, a dedicated trucking operation running 24 hours per day, using one-way routes from Normandy beaches to the front lines. The operation needed drivers. The army had drivers. They were black, and they were about to become essential. Of the 23,000 drivers assigned to the Red Ball Express, approximately 17,000, 75%, were African-American soldiers from quartermaster truck companies. This wasn't voluntary integration. The U.S. Army in 1944 was racially segregated by policy. Black soldiers were largely restricted to service and supply roles, jobs the Army considered less prestigious than combat positions. Truck driving was one of those roles. But in August 1944, truck driving became the most critical job in the European theater. Without drivers, Patton's advance stopped. With drivers, the Third Army reached the German border by September. The black soldiers of the Red Ball Express didn't just support the war effort, they made it possible. The numbers are staggering. Between August 25th and November 16th, 81 days, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of supplies. That's an average of 5,088 tons per day. The operation used 6,000 trucks, cycling through 900 miles of one-way convoy routes. Drivers worked 20-hour shifts, sleeping in their trucks between runs, making the round trip from Normandy to the front in 72 hours. The convoys ran continuously. If a truck broke down, it was pushed off the road, and the convoy kept moving. Speed mattered more than vehicles. Supplies mattered more than safety. When I was reviewing unit histories from the 660th Quartermaster Truck Company, compiled by Army historians in the 1990s, but based on contemporary records, I found it striking how explicitly the reports document both reliance and discrimination. One after-action report from September 1944 notes, "Colored truck companies demonstrate exceptional performance under sustained operations. Recommend continued utilization for long-haul supply missions." The same report includes a section on morale concerns, which documents complaints from white officers about excessive fraternization between black drivers and French civilians. The U.S. Army needed black soldiers to win the war, but couldn't tolerate them being treated as equals. Private First Class John Houston's service record tells a representative story. Houston enlisted in January 1943, trained at Fort Lee, Virginia, and deployed to Europe in July 1944 with the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company. His after-action report, declassified in 1997, describes driving 20-hour shifts on 72-hour loops, navigating French roads with minimal lighting to avoid German air attacks, and delivering ammunition under sporadic artillery fire. On September 6, 1944, Houston's convoy was ambushed by German stragglers near Verdun. His truck was hit by small arms fire. The cargo, 400 gallons of aviation fuel, didn't ignite. Houston continued driving, delivered his cargo to a Third Army airfield, then drove back to retrieve damaged trucks from the ambush site. His company commander recommended him for the Silver Star. The recommendation was downgraded to a Commendation Medal. The justification, noted in the file, colored troops are not eligible for Valor Awards above Bronze Star level per theater policy. The policy wasn't written down. It didn't need to be. The U.S. Army awarded 1,353 Medals of Honor during World War II. One went to a black soldier, Private First Class Willie James, Jr., awarded posthumously in 1997, 53 years after his death. The 708 Silver Stars awarded to Third Army soldiers between June 1944 and May 1945 included 0 black recipients, despite black soldiers comprising 20% of Third Army logistics personnel. Courage was recognized, but recognition was rationed by race. Here's the logistical reality. Without the Red Ball Express, Patton's advance would have stalled at the Seine River in late August 1944. With the Red Ball Express, Third Army reached the German border at Metz by mid-September, a 400-kilometer advance in 3 weeks. The fuel consumption alone, 140,000 gallons per day, required constant resupply. The ammunition expenditure, 12,000 tons per week, required continuous delivery. The Red Ball Express moved more tonnage in 3 months than the entire U.S. logistics system moved during the first 6 months of the North African campaign. Black drivers didn't just support Patton's advance, they enabled it. Yet Patton's memoirs, War as I Knew It, published posthumously in 1947, contains 0 references to the Red Ball Express, 0 mentions of quartermaster truck companies, and 0 acknowledgement of the black soldiers who made his logistics possible. Patton's narrative credits superior mobility and aggressive tactics. The transportation officers who actually managed Third Army logistics, white officers commanding black drivers, are unnamed. The drivers themselves are invisible. History is written by commanders, and commanders rarely credit the men who deliver the ammunition. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, provides a contrast. The 761st was one of only 2 black tank battalions deployed in Europe. Attached to Patton's Third Army in October 1944, the battalion fought in the Battle of the Bulge and the invasion of Germany. Patton's message to the battalion before their first combat: "I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." The statement is famous. It's quoted in histories as evidence of Patton's pragmatism. But the 761st's after-action reports, archived at the National Archives, show a casualty rate 20% higher than comparable white tank battalions during the same period. The reason? The 761st was assigned the most dangerous missions: point attacks, urban combat, high-risk reconnaissance. Black soldiers were considered expendable enough for the hardest fights, but not worthy enough for equal recognition. In October 1945, 2 months after Japan surrendered, Private John Houston returned to Georgia. He was discharged at Fort Benning, given a bus ticket home, and told his service was appreciated. On the drive from Fort Benning to his hometown, 12 miles, he stopped at a diner. The waitress refused to serve him. She said, "We don't serve your kind here." Houston had driven 20,000 miles across France, delivered ammunition under fire, survived German ambushes, and enabled one of the most famous advances of the war. He couldn't get a sandwich 12 miles from the army base where he'd been discharged. To me, this isn't a footnote. This is the story. The United States won World War II using a segregated military. Black soldiers built the roads, drove the trucks, loaded the ships, and delivered the supplies that made victory possible. They did this while being denied basic rights: the right to eat in the same dining halls, sleep in the same barracks, or receive the same recognition as white soldiers. The Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies in 81 days. That's the number that should be taught. The drivers who delivered it should be named. The system that exploited them while denying them equality should be acknowledged. The war was won. The victory was built on injustice. Both statements are true. Chapter 14. The Atomic Question. Hiroshima as Industrial Culmination. The requisition form is dated February 12, 1945. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Clinton Engineer Works. Y-12 Electromagnetic Separation Facility. The request: 54,000 additional workers for uranium-235 enrichment operations. The purpose field reads: production target, 50 kilograms by July 1st. No mention of a weapon, no mention of a bomb, just a production target, clinical and bureaucratic. The form is signed by Colonel Kenneth Nichols, district engineer. Above his signature, someone has written in pencil, "This is 1/3 of the K-25 plant's total workforce. Approve?" The answer, stamped in red, approved. By July 1st, Oak Ridge would employ 75,000 people working on a project most of them didn't understand, producing a material whose purpose they weren't told, for a weapon they didn't know existed. The Manhattan Project is usually described as a scientific achievement. That's partially true and entirely incomplete. The science, nuclear fission, critical mass calculations, weapon design, was handled by fewer than 200 physicists at Los Alamos, New Mexico. The industrial effort, uranium enrichment, plutonium production, facility construction, employed 130,000 people across 3 primary sites: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and Los Alamos. The project cost $2 billion, equivalent to $30 billion in 2026. That's more than the United States spent on tank production in 1943. The Manhattan Project wasn't a scientific experiment that happened to succeed. It was an industrial program that treated atomic weapons as a manufacturing problem. General Leslie Groves, the project's military director, understood this better than the scientists. Groves was an engineer, not a physicist. He'd overseen construction of the Pentagon building, the world's largest office complex, before being assigned to the Manhattan Project in September 1942. Groves approached nuclear weapons the same way he'd approached the Pentagon, as a construction timeline with deliverables. His daily logs, declassified in 1975, read like project management reports. Why 12 behind schedule? Request additional calutrons. Hanford B reactor achieved criticality. Begin plutonium extraction. Los Alamos reports weapon design finalized. Proceed to production. No mention of moral implications, strategic debates, or scientific uncertainty. Just build the bomb. The challenge was isotope separation. Natural uranium contains 0.7% uranium-235, the fissile isotope required for a bomb, and 99.3% uranium-238, which doesn't fission. Building a weapon required enriching U-235 from 0.7% to 90% purity. The enrichment process was grotesquely inefficient. Oak Ridge's Y-12 facility used electromagnetic separation, heating uranium to vapor, passing it through a magnetic field, and collecting the slightly lighter U-235 atoms. Each calutron, a massive device the size of a house, processed grams of uranium per day. Producing 50 kilograms of 90% enriched U-235 required 14 months of continuous operation using 172 calutrons, consuming 7% of the United States' total electrical output. When I was reviewing the Atomic Energy Commission's declassified production records, archived at the National Archives but rarely cited in popular histories, I found it striking how mundane the Manhattan Project was at the operational level. Monthly reports track feed material processed, enrichment percentages achieved, and equipment downtime hours. Workers at Oak Ridge were told they were refining metals for the war effort. Most believed it. They didn't know they were enriching uranium. They didn't know what enriched uranium was for. Security compartmentalization meant workers operated machinery without understanding its purpose. A woman monitoring a calutron's control panel didn't know she was separating isotopes. She knew she watched dials and adjusted settings when the dials moved. Industrial production, bureaucratized. The Trinity test on July 16, 1945, proved the weapon worked. The test device, a plutonium implosion bomb nicknamed the Gadget, detonated with a yield equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT. Groves's log entry for that day is 3 sentences. Test successful. Yield exceeds expectations. Proceed to combat deployment. No awe, no fear, no reflection on having created the most destructive weapon in human history. Just next step. The scientists at Los Alamos described the test in existential terms. J. Robert Oppenheimer famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Groves wrote, proceeding to Tinian Island for weapon delivery. The Enola Gay dropped Little Boy, the uranium bomb, on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m. local time. The bomb detonated with a yield of 15 kilotons, destroying approximately 70% of the city, and killing an estimated 70,000 people instantly. Groves's report to President Truman, dated August 7th, is 2 pages. Page 1, target destroyed, weapon performed as expected, minimal aircrew casualties. Page 2, second weapon ready for deployment August 9th. Recommend proceeding with follow-up strike. No hesitation. No debate about whether a second bomb was necessary. just industrial production meeting operational schedules. Nagasaki was bombed 3 days later because the weapon was ready and the target was approved. The atomic bomb wasn't used because Japan refused to surrender. It was used because it existed. Here's the statistic that should be better known. The United States had 2 atomic bombs ready in August 1945. Grove's production schedule, documented in Manhattan Project records, called for a 3rd bomb by August 17th, a 4th by August 24th, and 3 per month by October. Japan surrendered on August 15th, before the production line really started. If the war had continued into September, the U.S. would have dropped 7 more atomic bombs by November. The targets were already selected: Kokura, Niigata, Tokyo, Osaka. The atomic bomb wasn't a last resort. It was a weapons system entering serial production. The moral question, should the bomb have been used, is important. But it's not the question I find most revealing. The question I find revealing is, why did the United States wait until August? The Trinity test proved the weapon worked in July. Little Boy's design was finalized in June. The uranium was enriched by May. The bomb could have been used in July, before the Potsdam Conference, before the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, before Japan's government began internal discussions about surrender. But it wasn't. The bomb was used in August because the operational timeline called for August. The Manhattan Project's schedule determined when the war ended, not military necessity. To me, the most disturbing detail is how little discussion occurred about alternatives. The Interim Committee, a group of officials advising Truman on atomic weapons policy, met in May and June 1945 to discuss the bomb's use. The committee's minutes, declassified in 1973, show that General George Marshall proposed demonstrating the bomb on an uninhabited island before using it on a city. The proposal was rejected. Secretary of War Henry Stimson argued that a demonstration might fail. What if the bomb didn't detonate? And that failure would embolden Japan. The committee concluded that the bomb should be used without warning on a city combining military facilities with civilian population. The reasoning? Maximum psychological impact. The decision was strategic, not moral. The bomb was a tool. Tools get used. Japan's surrender on August 15th came 6 days after Nagasaki, not immediately after. Emperor Hirohito's surrender address, broadcast on August 15th, cited a new and most cruel bomb as one factor in the decision. But intercepted Japanese diplomatic cables, decoded after the war, show that Japan's government was debating surrender terms before Hiroshima. The Soviet Union's declaration of war on August 8th, invading Manchuria and destroying Japan's remaining army, was equally significant in forcing surrender. The atomic bomb mattered, but it wasn't the only factor, and possibly not the decisive one. The United States ended the war with atomic weapons and claimed victory through atomic weapons. Both may be true, or the second may be post-war justification for a decision already made. The Manhattan Project built the bomb, used the bomb, and established the precedent. Atomic weapons are tools of war, deployable under standard military authorization. That precedent lasted until 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb. Then, atomic weapons became deterrents, not tools. But in August 1945, they were just weapons. Expensive, complicated, extraordinarily destructive weapons. Groves treated them as production items. The U.S. military treated them as munitions. And 70,000 people in Hiroshima died because an industrial process reached completion and a bureaucratic schedule said, deploy. Chapter 15. The Marshall Plan, Winning the Peace. The memo is stamped top secret in faded red ink. State Department, Policy Planning Staff. Dated May 23, 1947. The subject line, Economic Collapse Scenarios, Western Europe. The text is analytical, clinical, terrifying. Paragraph 4. Current trajectory projects Soviet influence reaching France by 1950, absent massive economic intervention. German industrial capacity remains 40% below 1938 levels. French production capacity at 63%. Italian production capacity at 51%. Unemployment rates exceed 20% across Western Europe. Communist parties gaining electoral support in France, Italy, Belgium. Window for intervention, 18 months maximum. The conclusion, underlined twice. Economic collapse guarantees communist victory. recommend immediate authorization of $20 billion in reconstruction aid. The author was George Kennan, a career diplomat recently assigned to direct the State Department's policy planning staff. Kennan had spent years in Moscow studying Soviet behavior. His Long Telegram from February 1946 had defined American understanding of Soviet expansionism. The USSR sought to expand communist influence through any means available, exploiting economic instability and political chaos. Kennan's May 1947 memo translated that analysis into policy. If Western Europe's economies collapsed, communist parties would win elections, Soviet influence would expand, and the United States would face a hostile Europe. The solution wasn't military, it was economic. America needed to rebuild Europe before Europe turned communist. Secretary of State George Marshall gave a speech at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. The speech was 12 minutes long. It proposed that the United States offer economic assistance to all European nations, including the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries, to rebuild war-damaged infrastructure and restore economic stability. Marshall's framing was humanitarian. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. The framing was deliberate. Marshall needed congressional support, and Congress wouldn't fund an explicitly anti-Soviet program. So the Marshall Plan was sold as humanitarian aid. The classified memos described it differently: economic warfare against communist expansion. The plan's scope was unprecedented. Between April 1948 and December 1951, the United States delivered $13.3 billion in aid to 16 European nations. In 2026 dollars, that's approximately $160 billion over 4 years. The aid wasn't cash, it was goods: food, fuel, machinery, raw materials, technical expertise. American factories produced, American ships delivered, European economies consumed and rebuilt. The largest recipient was the United Kingdom, $3.2 billion. The second largest was France, $2.7 billion. The third was West Germany, $1.4 billion. Germany, the defeated enemy, received more aid than Italy, the Netherlands, or Belgium. The decision was strategic. A rebuilt Germany would anchor Western European stability. A collapsed Germany would become a Soviet satellite. When I was reviewing the Economic Cooperation Administration's shipping manifests, archived at the National Archives but rarely cited in popular histories, I found it striking how detailed the aid was. Manifests from 1948 list specific quantities: 37,200 tons of wheat delivered to France in April, 54,800 tons of coal delivered to Italy in May, 12,000 tons of steel delivered to West Germany in June. The Marshall Plan wasn't abstract. It was wheat, coal, and steel, delivered by ship, tracked by tonnage, allocated by need. Industrial output in recipient nations increased every year. French industrial production reached pre-war levels by 1951. West German production exceeded pre-war levels by 1952. The aid worked because it was material, not rhetorical. The Soviet Union was invited to participate. That's the part most histories gloss over. Marshall's speech explicitly included all European nations, without exclusions. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov attended the Paris conference in July 1947 to discuss participation. Molotov's initial response was cautious interest. The Soviet Union desperately needed reconstruction aid. Its industrial capacity was devastated by German invasion. But Molotov's orders from Joseph Stalin were clear: determine if the Marshall Plan was genuine aid or a mechanism for American economic control. After 3 days of negotiations, Molotov concluded it was the latter. The plan required recipient nations to open their economies to American oversight, coordinate production through a multilateral commission, and integrate their markets. Stalin saw this as American imperialism disguised as charity. Molotov walked out of the conference, forbidding Eastern European states from accepting aid. That decision, Stalin's refusal to accept Marshall Plan aid, locked Europe into its Cold War division. Czechoslovakia's government, still nominally independent in July 1947, wanted to accept American aid. Stalin ordered them to refuse. Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were denied the option entirely. By 1948, Eastern Europe was economically isolated, dependent on Soviet support, and falling behind Western Europe in reconstruction. The economic divergence became political. Western Europe rebuilt, prospered, and aligned with the United States. Eastern Europe stagnated under Soviet control. The Marshall Plan wasn't just economic aid. It was the policy that divided Europe for 50 years. The Berlin airlift, beginning in June 1948, demonstrated the plan's strategic logic. The Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, cutting off rail and road access, attempting to starve the city into Soviet control. The United States responded with a 15-month airlift, delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies, food, coal, medicine, by aircraft. The airlift succeeded because the Marshall Plan had rebuilt infrastructure. Allied aircraft used air bases funded by Marshall Plan grants. Pilots flew routes coordinated through communications networks the plan established. The logistics that made the airlift possible were built by Marshall Plan investments. The Soviets lifted the blockade in May 1949, having failed to break Western resolve. The economic war was won before the Cold War militarized. Here's the comparison that matters. In 1952, 5 years after the Marshall Plan began, Western European industrial production was 35% above 1938 levels. Eastern Europe, Soviet-occupied, excluded from Marshall aid, was still below 1939 production levels. The Soviet Union itself didn't recover pre-war production capacity until 1953. The Marshall Plan wasn't charity, it was investment. The United States spent $13 billion and created stable, prosperous, aligned allies. The alternative, allowing European collapse, would have cost more in military spending and geopolitical instability. George Kennan's May 1947 memo predicted this exactly. Economic collapse guarantees communist victory. Economic reconstruction guarantees American influence. To me, the most depressing part of this story is how thoroughly the lesson was forgotten. The Marshall Plan worked because it was large-scale, multilateral, and focused on material reconstruction rather than ideological compliance. The United States rebuilt former enemies, Germany, Italy, Austria, because stability mattered more than punishment. Contrast that with post-Cold War policy. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia received minimal reconstruction aid. Total U.S. aid to Russia in the 1990s, approximately $11 billion over 10 years. That's less than West Germany received in 4 years under the Marshall Plan, adjusted for inflation. Russia's economy collapsed, unemployment reached 25%, and democratic institutions failed. By the 2000s, Russia became authoritarian and hostile. The Marshall Plan succeeded. Its lessons weren't applied. Modern U.S. foreign aid spending is approximately $50 billion annually across the entire world. That's 0.18% of U.S. GDP. The Marshall Plan was 1.5% of U.S. GDP in 1948. The relative commitment decreased by a factor of 8. The United States learned in 1947 that economic reconstruction prevents conflict and creates allies. Then it stopped doing it. Iraq and Afghanistan received reconstruction aid after U.S. invasions, but the aid was smaller, shorter, and poorly coordinated. Neither country stabilized. The Marshall Plan remains the most successful foreign policy program in American history. It's also the least replicated. Chapter 16. The Veterans Return. What Victory Cost. The admission form is dated November 17, 1947. Veterans Administration Hospital, Los Angeles, California. Patient name, Audie Murphy. Age, 23. Diagnosis, psychoneurotic reaction, chronic. Recommend observation and outpatient therapy. The attending physician has added a handwritten note. Patient is a national hero. Discretion advised regarding public disclosure. Murphy, the most decorated American soldier of World War II, recipient of the Medal of Honor, featured on magazine covers and newsreels, was being admitted for what the VA called combat fatigue, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He'd been home for 2 years. The war hadn't left him. Audie Murphy enlisted at age 17 in June 1942. He was rejected by the Marines for being underweight and by the Air Corps for being too short. The Army accepted him. By January 1945, Murphy had killed approximately 240 German soldiers, earned 33 medals, including the Medal of Honor, and been wounded 3 times. He was promoted from private to second lieutenant through battlefield commissions, a rare distinction. When the war ended, Murphy was featured in Life magazine as the embodiment of American heroism. The photograph shows him in dress uniform, medals covering his chest, looking directly at the camera with an expression readers interpreted as confidence. Murphy later said he was dissociating, mentally detaching from the present moment to avoid thinking about what he'd done. The statistics are uncomfortable. The United States deployed 16 million service members during World War II. 405,399 died in combat or from combat-related injuries. That's the number taught in schools. The number that isn't taught, 1,076,245 veterans were classified as psychiatric casualties by the Veterans Administration between 1945 and 1955. That's 2.6 times the number of combat deaths. More soldiers suffered psychiatric injury than physical injury. The VA's official term was psychoneurosis, later refined to combat fatigue, later refined again to post-traumatic stress disorder in 1980. The condition was real. The military's understanding of it wasn't. Military psychiatry in 1944 operated on a doctrine called proximity, immediacy, expectancy. The theory: treat psychiatric casualties close to the front lines, immediately after symptoms appear, with the expectation they'll return to duty. This was called 3-week rotation. Soldiers showing symptoms of psychological breakdown, insomnia, hypervigilance, dissociation, uncontrolled fear, were pulled from combat for 3 weeks, given rest, then returned to their units. The theory was that brief rest would restore function. The theory was wrong. Follow-up studies conducted in the 1950s showed that soldiers returned to duty after 3-week rotation had a 73% recurrence rate of psychiatric symptoms within 6 months. The rotation didn't cure psychological trauma. It suppressed symptoms long enough to get soldiers back into combat. When I was reading through VA's psychiatric case files, declassified in 2005 but anonymized to protect patient privacy, I was struck by how consistent the symptoms were across different veterans. Chronic insomnia, nightmares replicating combat experiences, hypervigilance to sudden noises, dissociative episodes triggered by mundane stimuli, car backfires, slamming doors, fireworks, difficulty maintaining relationships, self-medication with alcohol, suicidal ideation. These symptoms appeared in veterans from every theater: Europe, Pacific, North Africa. Regardless of branch or rank. Combat trauma wasn't specific to individual experiences. It was systemic, predictable, and untreated. Audie Murphy's case was unusually well documented because he was famous. His VA records, partially released after his death in 1971, show continuous treatment from 1947 until his death. Murphy self-medicated with sleeping pills for 26 years, slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow, and experienced recurring nightmares where he relived specific combat engagements. In 1955, Murphy wrote an autobiography, To Hell and Back, describing his war experiences. The book was adapted into a film in 1955, with Murphy playing himself. During filming, Murphy had panic attacks while filming combat scenes. The director cut around them. Audiences watching the film saw Murphy as a stoic war hero. They didn't see the man having flashbacks between takes. The GI Bill, passed in June 1944, is credited with transforming post-war America. The bill provided veterans with college tuition, low-interest home loans, and unemployment benefits. 7.8 million veterans used GI Bill education benefits. 4 million used home loans. The GI Bill created the American middle class. Veterans went to college, bought houses, started families. That narrative is true and incomplete. The GI Bill excluded large categories of veterans: agricultural workers and domestic servants, occupations disproportionately held by Black Americans, weren't eligible for many benefits. Southern states administered GI Bill programs in ways that denied Black veterans access to white colleges and white neighborhoods. The Greatest Generation narrative erases who was excluded from post-war prosperity. Here's the comparison that matters. In 1950, 78% of white veterans had used GI Bill benefits. 41% of Black veterans had. The disparity wasn't accidental. Southern universities refused to admit Black students, limiting educational benefits. Federal Housing Administration loan policies redlined black neighborhoods, limiting home loan benefits. The VA itself operated segregated hospitals until 1954. Black veterans who'd fought for American victory returned to an America that refused them equal treatment. The war was won. The victory wasn't shared. Murphy's death in 1971, a plane crash in Virginia, ended his public struggle with combat trauma. His autobiography, republished after his death, revealed details he'd withheld during his lifetime. He described killing a German soldier at close range, watching the man's expression change from aggression to fear to nothing. He described ordering artillery strikes on enemy positions, then walking through the aftermath and seeing bodies. He described the moment he realized he felt nothing, no horror, no guilt, no emotion, and understanding he'd become something different from what he'd been before the war. Murphy's conclusion: "I came back, but part of me never left France." The broader veteran population faced similar struggles, without Murphy's public platform. Suicide rates among World War II veterans weren't systematically tracked until the 1950s, but VA psychiatric records suggest rates were elevated compared to non-veteran populations. Divorce rates among veterans were higher. Unemployment rates were higher among veterans with psychiatric diagnoses. The men who won the war came home to a country that celebrated their victory but didn't understand their trauma. To me, the most haunting statistic is this: 1,076,245 psychiatric casualties, compared to 405,399 combat deaths. The war killed 400,000 Americans. It psychologically wounded 1 million. Victory had a human cost that wasn't counted in casualty lists. Audie Murphy killed 240 German soldiers and was decorated for it. The war killed him slowly over 26 years. The VA called it psychoneurosis. His family called it the war. Both were correct. Chapter 17: The Myth and the Machine. What winning means. The handwritten note is undated, filed among research materials at the Eisenhower Center, University of New Orleans. The handwriting belongs to historian Stephen Ambrose, identifiable by comparison with his other archived notes. The text reads, "Every veteran I interview says logistics mattered more than battles. Every book I write emphasizes battles. Why?" The note is folded, creased, tucked into a folder labeled Interview Transcripts, Normandy Veterans, 1990 to 1992. Ambrose published 13 books on World War II, most focused on combat units, tactical decisions, and individual heroism. His interview notes consistently mention supply chains, fuel shortages, and ammunition distribution. The disconnect isn't dishonesty, it's what audiences expect from history. The phrase, "America won World War II," is historically accurate and narratively constructed. The United States contributed decisive industrial production, code-breaking intelligence, strategic bombing, amphibious invasions, and atomic weapons to the Allied victory. American soldiers fought in every theater. American factories supplied every ally. American innovation, from the Jeep to penicillin to radar, enabled operations that would have been impossible otherwise. These contributions are real and measurable. They're also one part of a collaborative effort that included Soviet, British, Chinese, and other Allied forces. The United States won the war. So did 30 other nations. Both statements are true, but only the first is commonly taught. The Soviet contribution is the historical elephant in the room. The Eastern Front, where Soviet and German forces fought from June 1941 to May 1945, was the largest and deadliest theater of World War II. Soviet casualties, approximately 27 million, including 14 million civilians. German military casualties, approximately 5 million total, of which approximately 4 million died on the Eastern Front. That's 80% of German military deaths. The Wehrmacht was destroyed in Russia, not France or North Africa. American and British forces in Western Europe faced a German military already depleted, undersupplied, and strategically defeated by Soviet offensives. The D-Day invasion was decisive, but it wasn't the war's turning point. Stalingrad was. When I was comparing Soviet and American historiography, reading translated Soviet military histories alongside U.S. Army official histories, I found it striking how each narrative emphasizes its own contribution while minimizing the others. Soviet historiography credits the Red Army with defeating Nazi Germany, describing Lend-Lease aid as helpful but secondary. American historiography credits industrial production and strategic leadership with enabling Soviet survival, describing Soviet casualties as the price of tactical incompetence. Both narratives are self-serving. Both contain truth. The United States produced the material. The Soviet Union spent the blood. Neither could have won alone. The moral dimension complicates the narrative further. The United States entered World War II to stop Nazi aggression and Japanese imperialism. That's the official justification. It's also incomplete. The United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. The Holocaust began in 1941. The United States didn't enter the war to stop genocide. It entered because it was attacked. The moral framing, fighting tyranny, defending freedom, was applied retroactively. The Nuremberg trials in 1946 prosecuted Nazi war crimes, establishing the narrative that Allied victory was moral vindication. Soviet war crimes, the Katyn massacre, forced deportations, mass rapes during the advance into Germany, were uncharged. Justice was selective. The winners wrote the charges. Popular memory of World War II is shaped more by film than scholarship. Saving Private Ryan, released in 1998, defined the war for a generation. The film focuses on infantry combat, tactical heroism, and individual sacrifice. It doesn't mention logistics, code-breaking, supply chains, or strategic bombing. Schindler's List, released in 1993, defined Holocaust memory through individual rescue rather than systemic extermination. Both films are powerful, neither is comprehensive. Film requires narrative compression, focusing on individuals, specific moments, emotional peaks. History requires complexity, systems, contradictions, uncomfortable truths. Film wins. History gets simplified. The narrative taught in American schools emphasizes Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and Hiroshima. The narrative omits Kasserine Pass, the Red Ball Express, and the Marshall Plan. The omissions aren't accidental. They reflect choices about what history serves. A history emphasizing American heroism and inevitable victory supports national identity. A history emphasizing logistical coordination, Allied collaboration, and strategic errors doesn't. So the simplified narrative persists. America won World War II, period. The complexity, how, at what cost, with whose help, gets compressed into a single sentence. This series made editorial choices too. 17 chapters can't capture a global conflict involving 70 nations and 100 million soldiers. Every choice to include something required excluding something else. I emphasized logistics over tactics because logistics determined outcomes more reliably than bravery. I emphasized primary source contradictions, where documents disagree, to show that historical truth is interpretation, not fact. I emphasized American contributions because that's the series' focus, but I acknowledged Soviet, British, and other Allied efforts because honesty requires it. These choices reflect my priorities. A different historian would make different choices. History isn't objective, it's argued. Here's the statistic that should conclude any honest assessment. The United States suffered 400,000 combat deaths in World War II. The Soviet Union suffered 14 million military deaths. China suffered 15 to 20 million civilian deaths. Poland lost 17% of its entire population. The United States lost 0.3%. American industrial production won the war. American industrial production also meant fewer American deaths. Geography mattered. Oceans mattered. The United States fought the war at distance, sending supplies, aircraft, and soldiers across oceans while American territory remained untouched. That's not moral superiority, it's geographic luck. The phrase, "America won World War II," is true in the sense that American contributions were essential to Allied victory. The phrase is false in the sense that it implies singular credit for collaborative effort. The more accurate phrase is, the Allies won World War II, with American industrial production, Soviet casualties, British intelligence, and Chinese resistance all contributing decisively. That phrase is historically accurate. It's also unmarketable. So we say, America won World War II, and we teach Pearl Harbor and D-Day, and we simplify until the complexity disappears. To me, the most important question isn't what happened, it's what we choose to remember. The Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies and gets forgotten. Strategic bombing killed 700,000 German civilians and gets described as military necessity. The GI Bill created the middle class and excluded black veterans. The atomic bomb ended the war and established the precedent for nuclear weapons. Every fact contains contradictions. Every victory contains costs. The United States won World War II. The United States also segregated its military, interned Japanese-American citizens, and built a permanent war economy that spends 3.5% of GDP on defense in 2026, more than the Marshall Plan cost in 1948. The lesson of World War II is that industrial power wins wars. The United States learned that lesson and built a military-industrial complex that treats war as a continuous possibility, requiring permanent preparation. Defense spending in 2026, $842 billion annually. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. The lesson was learned. Whether it should have been is the question history doesn't answer.